The morning Victor Rourke rode into town and told 3 different shop owners that any man who hired Eliza Hartwell would find his credit line cut by the end of the week. He did it before breakfast. Not out of anger, not out of desperation. He did it the way a man swats a fly casually, almost cheerfully, without breaking stride. He had never spoken a single word to Eliza in his life. He simply did not want her employed. A young woman asking questions, moving through spaces men controlled, remembering things she wasn't supposed to remember. That kind of woman was a problem best handled early. So he handled her, and then he went and had his eggs. If you've ever been dismissed before you opened your mouth, if you've ever watched a door close in your face and known it had nothing to do with what you were capable of, then you already know how this story begins. Stay with us until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The first door closed in her face at 7 in the morning. Eliza Hartwell had been awake since before dawn, which was nothing unusual. She'd spent the last 4 years waking before the sun out of pure necessity, because the window in the room she'd rented above the feed warehouse let in a draft that made sleeping past 5 nearly impossible, and because she had learned, somewhere in those 4 years, that the earlier she was, somewhere, the harder it was for people to pretend she wasn't there. She had walked 1.5 miles from the edge of Harlow Creek to reach Dunbar's general store, and she had practiced what she intended to say for most of that walk. She needed work. She was a capable cook, better than capable if she was being honest with herself, though she'd learned that saying so tended to work against her. She was reliable, she didn't complain, and she was willing to start that same morning if they needed her. Martin Dunbar looked at her from behind his counter for about 4 seconds. "We're not hiring," he said. "I was told you might need someone in the back," Eliza said. "For meal preparation. For the hired men. Who told you that?" She hesitated. "Mrs. Aldridge at the boarding house." Dunbar's expression shifted slightly, not to something warmer, just to something more deliberate. "Mrs. Aldridge doesn't know my business," he said. "And I said, we're not hiring. You can see yourself out." She saw herself out. The second door was a saloon called the Copper Rail, which she had no illusions about, but which had a kitchen that reportedly fed 30 men lunch every day. The man behind the bar was younger than Dunbar and meaner about it. He looked her over in the particular way that made her want to stand differently. She didn't, but the impulse was there, and then he laughed. "You cook?" he said. "I do." "For who?" "For the Aldridge boarding house the last 2 years. Before that, the Granger family in Billings." He laughed again. It wasn't a friendly sound. "The Grangers in Billings," he repeated, like it was the name of a joke he already knew the punchline to. "Sweetheart, I need somebody who can handle 30 hungry men hollering at once. You look like you'd fall over in a strong wind." "I've handled worse than 30 hungry men," Eliza said. "Yeah." He turned back to wiping down the bar. "I'll bet you have. Doors behind you." She walked back out into the pale morning light and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold air settle around her. Her boots had a crack along the left sole that let in moisture when the ground was wet, and the ground was wet. She could feel it, a thin, persistent cold creeping up through the leather. She had $4.60 in her coat pocket. She had walked past Black Pine Ranch twice in the last 2 years without ever having a reason to stop. It sat about 3 miles outside of Harlow Creek along the northern road, a working cattle ranch. Not large by some measures, but substantial enough to have a reputation. The owner, Caleb Mercer, had been a fixture in the territory for 15 years. His wife had died 4 winters back, and by all accounts the place had been running on grit and stubbornness ever since. 12 ranch hands, a cook who'd quit in December, and a kitchen that reportedly hadn't produced a proper meal in 6 weeks. She had heard that from Mrs. Aldridge, too, who heard everything. The question of whether to try Black Pine had been sitting in the back of Eliza's mind since the previous afternoon when Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned, with the careful neutrality of someone sharing information they expected to be ignored, that Caleb Mercer had turned away 2 applicants already that week. Both men, both with references. Eliza had not said anything in response to that. She had just filed it away. Now, standing on the sidewalk outside the Copper Rail with wet feet and $4.60, she thought about what Martin Dunbar's face had looked like when she'd asked about work. She thought about the bartender's laugh. She thought about the $3 she owed Mrs. Aldridge at the end of the month, and the fact that the boarding house above the feed warehouse was the only place in Harlow Creek that had been willing to rent to her at all. She turned north. The walk to Black Pine took her 40 minutes, and for most of it she was alone on the road with the kind of silence Montana does in late spring, not peaceful exactly, just indifferent. The land didn't care about her. That was oddly steadying. She had grown up in Missouri, moved west with her aunt at 16, and spent the years since then in a series of arrangements that all had one thing in common. They depended entirely on whether the person in charge of the arrangement felt, on any given day, that she was worth the trouble. Her aunt had been a practical woman who had not been unkind but who had made it clear, in 100 small ways, that Eliza was a guest in her life and not a permanent one. When the aunt remarried at 52, the new husband had made it clearer still. Eliza had left at 19 with a suitcase, a recipe box that had belonged to her mother, and the understanding that she would not be coming back. She was not bitter about it. Or rather, she had been, and then she had worked through most of it, the way you work through a bad winter. It happened. You survived it. You didn't have to pretend it was fine. What she hadn't worked through was the particular exhaustion of being underestimated. That one still had teeth. Every time someone looked at her height, at her worn coat, at her face that people for some reason decided meant something and concluded, before she'd said a word, that she was not worth the time, something in her chest tightened in a way that felt less like hurt and more like fury carefully held in place. She had gotten very good at holding it in place. Black Pine Ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and her first impression was that it was a working place, not a pretty one. The main house was large but plain, 2 stories, a porch that needed repair along the western edge, windows that were clean but unadorned. The barn was bigger than the house and in better shape. 3 men were visible near the corral, and none of them looked up as she approached the gate. She stopped at the gate, because there was no bell and no sign, and called out, "I'm looking for Mr. Mercer." One of the men near the corral turned. He was somewhere around 30, with a weathered face, and the kind of permanent squint that came from too many years looking at things in bright sunlight. He looked at her for a moment without expression. "He's in the house," the man said. "You selling something?" "I'm looking for work," Eliza said. "I heard he needs a cook." The man looked at her for another moment, then turned to the other 2 men and said something she couldn't hear. One of them laughed. The other one shrugged. "Go knock," the first man said. "He'll answer or he won't." She went and knocked. Caleb Mercer answered the door himself, which she hadn't entirely expected. She had imagined someone sending a hired hand, or a housekeeper, but it was the man himself, who appeared 42 years old, tall, with the kind of build that comes from decades of actual work rather than deliberate effort. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and he had the expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something that required concentration. He looked at her. She had gotten very good at reading that particular moment, the moment when a person decided what she was. She watched it happen in his face, though his face was harder to read than most. Not hostile, not amused the way the bartender had been amused, just assessing. The way you'd assess something you weren't sure had value yet. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "my name is Eliza Hartwell. I understand you're looking for a cook." "I was looking for a cook 2 weeks ago," he said. "Now I'm trying to figure out if I should just have the men cook for themselves and stop wasting mornings interviewing people who aren't going to work out." "Then this won't take long," Eliza said. "What do you need to know?" He studied her for a moment. "How long have you been cooking professionally?" 6 years, the last 2 at the Aldridge boarding house in town. Before that, private family in Billings, Aldridge. He seemed to know the name. "Dorothy Aldridge?" "Yes, she doesn't give references easily." "She gave me one," Eliza said. She had not brought the reference letter with her, because she had not been sure she was going to come here today until 40 minutes ago, and she said so, which was perhaps not the strategically ideal thing to say, but which seemed preferable to claiming she'd left it at home. Something in his expression shifted not toward warmth exactly, but toward attention, like she'd said something unexpected. "You walked 3 miles to ask for a job you didn't decide to apply for until this morning?" "I applied for 2 others first," she said. "They weren't interested." "You apparently need someone, and I need work. That seems like the kind of situation that should resolve itself." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got 12 men," he said. "They eat hard. They're not polite about it, and 3 of them have been actively hostile to the last 2 applicants, one of whom quit before he even started. Kitchen is in bad shape, stove needs repair. The pantry's been poorly managed for months. I'm telling you this up front because I'm tired of people saying they can handle it and then finding reasons to leave." "What happened to your last cook?" Eliza asked. "She left in December." "Family situation," he paused. "She was good, the men respected her." "That's not a common thing, I understand," Eliza said. He looked at her again, that same measuring look, though she thought it had changed slightly, like the measurement had shifted to a different scale. "Come in," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something. The stove had a crack in the firebox that someone had tried to patch with a clay compound that had since dried improperly. One of the burner plates sat at an angle. The pantry, she opened the door and stood there for a moment, just taking it in, had been organized by someone who apparently believed that placing items near their category was functionally the same as organizing them. Flour and salt on the same shelf was fine. Flour, salt, a rusted set of tin snips, 2 pairs of leather work gloves, and what appeared to be a single riding spur was less fine. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched her look at it without saying anything. She appreciated that. He didn't explain or apologize. He just let her see it. "How long has the stove been like this?" she asked. "Since February. Has anyone looked at it?" One man said he could fix it. He made it worse. She crouched down and looked at the firebox more carefully, then stood. "It's not unfixable," she said. "But whoever tries should know what they're doing." "Can you cook on it the way it is?" She thought about that honestly. The honest answer was probably, but not well, and not for 12 people without serious effort. "I can manage," she said, which was not dishonest exactly, just compressed. "Tonight," Caleb said, "supper, 12 men, whatever's in that pantry." He paused. "If they eat it and it's edible, you have the position. If they don't, I'll pay you for the evening and you can be on your way." She turned to look at him. "That's your interview process?" "It's efficient," he said. She looked back at the pantry. She looked at the stove. She looked at the low, late afternoon light coming through the single kitchen window, and she thought about the $4.60 in her coat pocket, and the crack in her left boot sole, and the 2 doors that had closed in her face before 9 in the morning. "What time do they eat?" she said. 6. "Then I'll need to start now." What she found in the pantry was a negotiation. There was a quantity of dried beans that was almost insulting, too much for one meal, not managed well enough to indicate anyone had been thinking about it systematically. There was cornmeal, some of it clumped with age. Salt pork, 3 pieces, one of which she set aside immediately as too far gone. 2 onions that were still firm. A small sack of dried apples she nearly missed behind a crate of nails. And on the top shelf, a tin of molasses that had crystallized around the lid and required a solid 10 minutes of patient work with a cloth and warm water before she could get it open. She stood in the kitchen alone for a few minutes after her initial survey, just thinking. She had cooked in worse kitchens. She had cooked for more demanding people. She had cooked on a fire built in a yard when the stove in the Granger house had needed replacing, and the replacement had taken 3 weeks to arrive, and she had kept 20 people fed in the meantime, without a single formal complaint, though there had been plenty of informal ones, which she had ignored. The challenge tonight was not purely about ingredients. She understood that clearly. The challenge was the men. She had worked around men her whole life. She knew the particular dynamics of a group of working men who ate together daily, the territorial nature of it, the way they used food as a kind of social measuring stick, the specific cruelty they could deploy when they felt like demonstrating something. She knew what it meant when a man pushed a plate away without tasting it, and she knew it usually had nothing to do with the food. She had to make something that smelled right before they sat down. That was the first thing. You couldn't walk into a room with 12 men who'd already decided to be difficult and expect a conversation to change their minds. But you could make the kitchen smell like something they hadn't had in a long time. And that could buy you 30 seconds of suspension of judgment. 30 seconds was sometimes enough. She built the fire in the firebox carefully, accounting for the uneven draft created by the cracked plate, and heated the beans in the largest pot she could find, a Dutch oven that was blessedly solid and well seasoned. She rendered the salt pork slowly, using the fat to start the onions, and let those cook down until they were deeply golden, not quickly, not carelessly, the way a person does when they're thinking about something else, but with intention. She added the molasses by small increments, tasting, adjusting. She used the dried apples in a way she hadn't quite planned until the idea arrived, reconstituting them in a little of the bean liquid until they softened, then adding them to the pot in the last hour so they'd take on the savory flavor, rather than sitting sweet and separate. The cornbread was the problem. With the stove operating the way it was, anything that required even consistent heat was going to be a problem. She had one cast iron skillet that was large enough to matter. She couldn't make individual pieces in the time she had. She made one large piece directly in the skillet, kept it lower than she usually would have, checked it more frequently than she usually would have, and turned it partway through using a method she'd developed once out of desperation and had used a dozen times since. It didn't look beautiful, but it was cooked through and it was not burned, and when she pressed the center, it had the give of something properly done. She heard the men coming in before 6. She heard them from the kitchen boots on the porch. Voices, the specific quality of a group of tired men at the end of a day when they're not bothering to moderate themselves. She heard laughter, short and rough. She heard someone say something she didn't catch, but that was followed by more laughter. She kept her back to the door and focused on the pot. The dining room at Black Pine had a long table, which she'd seen when Caleb had briefly walked her through the house. It seated 16, though only 12 would be using it tonight. She carried the Dutch oven out herself, which was heavy enough that her arms felt it, and set it on the trivet she'd placed at the center of the table. and then she went back for the cornbread and the small pot of pan drippings she'd seasoned into something that could pass for gravy. When she turned around from setting the pot down, she found the room watching her. Not all of them were hostile. She could see that in about 3 seconds of looking. Some of them were just tired, and they were looking at the pot on the table, and whatever they were thinking about her was secondary to the fact that there was something hot on the table that had not been there yesterday. But some of them were hostile. The one she'd been told to expect, Silas Boone, the oldest of the ranch hands, a man in his mid-50s, who had apparently made the previous 2 applicants miserable, was sitting at the far end of the table with the particular stillness of someone who has decided something in advance. He had a face built for skepticism and the kind of eyes that never quite looked like they were all the way present. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. He looked back at the pot. "What is he?" said. "Beans and salt pork," Eliza said. "Cornbread. That's it?" "That's what was in the pantry," she said. Silas looked at Caleb, who was standing slightly apart from the group near the head of the table. "We paying her for this?" "We're seeing how it goes," Caleb said in a voice that closed the conversation rather than opening it. Eliza served. She started at the far end of the table, opposite Silas, because starting near him would have had the look of seeking approval, and she had no interest in appearing to do that. She ladled the beans into bowls. They had the color and consistency she'd been working toward, and they smelled right. The molasses and the pork fat and the soft undertone of the apples threading through in a way that was probably surprising if you hadn't been standing over the pot for 3 hours. She watched the first man taste it. He was young, 20 maybe, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide things. He took a spoonful and chewed, and then looked at the bowl with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who expected something bad and got something that wasn't. He took another bite without saying anything. She kept serving. By the time she reached Silas Boone's end of the table, most of the men were eating. Not all of them had said anything. One of them, a man named Garrett, had said "not bad" in a tone that was meant to be dismissive, but that came out sounding almost sincere. Another man, she didn't know his name yet, had asked, without looking up from his bowl, whether there was more. Silas Boone looked at his bowl. He looked at her. "You put something sweet in here," he said. "Apple," she said. "In beans?" "In these beans," she said. He looked at the bowl for another moment. Then he picked up his spoon. She did not watch him eat. She turned back toward the kitchen because there was still pan drippings to bring out, and because watching a man like Silas Boone make up his mind was not a thing she should be seen doing. When she came back out with the gravy pot, Silas Boone's bowl was half empty. He was not talking to the men around him. He was just eating. But he was eating. The table stayed full for longer than she'd expected. That was the thing she noticed. Working men at the end of a day ate fast. They were hungry. They were tired. They had no particular reason to linger. But something about the way the meal had come together kept them at the table past the point where they might have pushed back their chairs and left. Someone's asked someone else a question. An argument about the fence line in the north pasture started up and ran through 2 more bowls of beans and a significant portion of the cornbread. The young man with the honest face, whose name she learned, was a 16-year-old named Noah, who helped with light work around the ranch and had apparently been eating whatever he could find since December stayed so long that Caleb finally told him he could have the last of the cornbread before it went stiff. Eliza washed the dishes. That was not technically her job for the evening. She'd been hired to cook. Not to clean up, but it was a useful thing to be doing, and the kitchen gave her a few minutes alone. Her arms ached from the Dutch oven. Her feet ached from the walk and the hours of standing. She had a small burn on her left wrist from where she'd misjudged the edge of the firebox when she'd adjusted the damper, and she had not let herself react to it in any way that would be visible. She heard the dining room sounds change gradually, chairs scraping, voices lowering, the specific shift in a group of people when they start to disperse rather than settle. She heard boots on the floor, the front door opening and closing. She heard, after a while, quieter footsteps. Caleb Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her with the same measuring expression he'd had all evening, but the scale had changed again. She could tell, though she couldn't have said precisely how. "The position's yours," he said. "Standard wage. Room in the house. You'll need to work out the pantry situation." "I'll need the stove looked at properly," she said. "By someone who knows what they're doing." "I'll find someone," he said. She dried her hands on the cloth she'd been using and looked at him directly. "One more thing," she said. "The boy. Noah. What about him? He's interested in cooking. He was watching me the whole time I was working. If I'm going to be managing that kitchen, I'd rather have someone useful than someone who has to be managed. If he's willing to learn, I'll teach him." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "That's not your decision to make," he said. "I'm not making it," she said. "I'm telling you what would make the kitchen work better. The decision's yours." There was a pause. Outside, she could hear the last of the ranch hands making their way to the bunkhouse. The night sounds of the ranch were settling in familiar sounds, she thought, of a place that knew what it was. "I'll think about it," Caleb said. He started to turn away, then paused. "That was a meal," he said, not warmly, not with particular emotion, just as a statement of fact. "It was what the pantry had," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded once and walked away down the hall. Eliza Hartwell turned back to the last of the dishes. Her left boot was still wet, and her wrist still stung, and there was a conversation tomorrow about the pantry situation that was going to require more patience than she currently felt. The stove was still broken. She still had 12 men to win over, one of whom had eaten half a bowl of beans under protest and would almost certainly arrive at breakfast looking for something to object to. She was tired in the way that comes from a day that required everything you had. Not bad tired, just spent. She finished the dishes, wiped down the surfaces she'd used, hung the cloth on the drying rack, and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. For the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she was somewhere she had earned her place. That didn't fix everything, she knew that. She had learned at some point, not all at once, but gradually, through accumulated experience, that earning something and keeping it were two entirely different problems, and the second one was usually harder. But she had gotten through the door, and the door for now was open. She turned out the lamp and went to find out where she was supposed to sleep. She found out where she was supposed to sleep the same way she found out most things at Black Pine, by asking directly and getting an answer that was technically complete, but left out several relevant details. The room was on the ground floor, off the back hallway past the kitchen, which had clearly been used for storage before someone made a recent and not entirely successful attempt to clear it. There was a narrow bed with a mattress that had seen better decades, a small chest of drawers with one handle missing, and a window that looked out onto the side yard. It was private, which mattered more than the mattress. She had slept in worse places without a door that closed. She did not sleep well that first night, but that had nothing to do with the mattress. It was the unfamiliar sounds, the creak of the house settling, the wind off the northern range, the occasional movement from the barn, and the particular alertness that comes from a new situation where you haven't yet figured out all the rules. She lay in the dark and thought about the pantry, about the stove, about the faces of 12 men around a table, and about Silas Boone's bowl, half empty. By 4:30 she gave up and went to start breakfast. That first week established patterns that would matter for months. She was in the kitchen before anyone else woke. She had coffee ready before the first ranch hand crossed the yard. Breakfast was plain. She was still learning what she had to work with, still making the stove cooperate through careful management of the damper and the fire, still taking stock of what the pantry held in any useful quantity and what it held as decoration. But plain and hot and on time every morning turned out to be worth more than she had expected. She did not try to win anyone over. That was a decision she'd made before she arrived, and she held to it. Trying to be liked in a situation like that one had a way of backfiring. Men who were already inclined to be difficult got worse when they sensed effort, the way some dogs got worse when you tried to approach them carefully. She just did the work. She cooked the meals. She kept the kitchen in a state of increasing functionality. When someone spoke to her, she answered. When someone didn't, she didn't push. Noah was the first exception to that general policy. He started appearing in the kitchen doorway 2 mornings after she arrived, which she had expected. She'd seen the way he watched her cook that first evening, not with the idle attention of someone with nothing else to do, but with the focused curiosity of a person who is actually trying to understand what they're seeing. He was 16 and had the quality of someone who had spent enough time around adults being ignored that he had learned to make himself useful instead. He did light work around the ranch, mending, hauling, the kind of tasks that didn't require sustained strength, and in exchange Caleb let him sleep in the small room off the barn and take his meals with the hands. She had no information about where he came from or why he was at Black Pine. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business, and he would tell her when he decided to, or he wouldn't. For 3 mornings he stood in the doorway and watched. On the 4th morning she handed him a knife and a pile of onions without a word, and he stepped into the kitchen and started cutting. He was terrible at it. The cuts were uneven and too thick, and he went too fast, which was the wrong instinct. You don't go faster with an unfamiliar knife. You go slower until you know what it does. She corrected him twice, showed him once, and then let him figure out the rest himself, because a person learns a skill differently when they're working it out than when someone is standing over them explaining it. By the end of the week, he could cut an onion in the time it used to take him to do half of one. She told him so. Not effusively, just factually, the way she'd have said the stove was running hotter today, or the beans needed another 20 minutes. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read and then went back to work. That was how it started. The stove repair happened on day 9, and it was not the smooth resolution she had hoped for. Caleb had found a man from town, someone who worked on equipment, not specifically stoves, which Eliza thought was a distinction worth making, but which she had not been able to make without sounding obstructive. The man arrived, looked at the firebox, made several sounds that conveyed confidence, and spent 3 hours doing something that resulted in the stove being functionally worse than it had been before. When Eliza discovered this at 5 in the morning the next day, the fire she'd built was burning unevenly in a new and specifically inconvenient direction, and she had biscuits that needed consistent heat. She stood in the kitchen for approximately 30 seconds deciding how to feel about it, and then she took the Dutch oven and placed it directly over the hottest section of the firebox, and built a secondary heat shield out of 2 bricks she found near the back step, which was not a solution she could recommend to anyone, and which required her to monitor the temperature manually for the entire duration of cooking. The biscuits were imperfect. They were also cooked through and warm, and they were on the table at 6, and nobody went without. Caleb came to find her afterward. "I heard there was a problem with the stove," he said. "There is," she said. "The repair made the draft worse. I'll have him come back." "Don't," she said. She said it more flatly than she intended and softened it slightly. "He doesn't know stoves. Find someone who does, or let me figure it out myself." A third attempt from someone working without the right knowledge is going to break the firebox plate the rest of the way. Caleb looked at her. He had the quality of a man who was not accustomed to being told things flatly, but who was capable of hearing it if the person saying it had a reason. She could see him working through whether she had a reason. "What do you need?" he said finally. "Someone who knows ironwork, not equipment repair in general, specifically stoves or fireplaces." He thought about it. "There's a man in Millhaven, 40 miles. If you want the kitchen to function properly, that's your answer." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a 2-day round trip." "I know," she said. "I can manage in the meantime." "I've been managing." Another pause. He looked at the stove, then at her. "I'll send for him," he said. The man from Millhaven arrived 8 days later and fixed the firebox in 4 hours. His name was Arn, and he worked with the particular economy of someone who had done the same task hundreds of times and no longer needed to think about it consciously. He identified the problem within 5 minutes of looking at it, asked Eliza 2 questions about how it had been burning, and then worked without talking until he was done. When he left, the stove ran level and clean, and Eliza stood in front of it and felt something she had not felt in the kitchen since arriving, the specific satisfaction of a tool that works the way it should. She made a soup that evening that she had been holding back, waiting for a stove she could trust. It was nothing elaborate, a beef bone broth she'd been asking Caleb about for a week. Finally gotten the bones for 3 days ago, and started slow simmering immediately, a base that had been developing on the back of the stove while she managed the front for other meals. Into it went onions, dried herbs she'd found in a tin behind the flour, potatoes that were still firm, and the last of the turnips from the root cellar in portions she'd been rationing carefully. The kitchen smelled, for the first time since she'd arrived, the way a kitchen was supposed to smell. Garrett, who was one of the men she had not yet figured out, not hostile, not friendly, just present in the way of someone who hadn't decided what to do with her yet, came into the kitchen doorway before dinner and stood there without saying anything. "Something you need," Eliza said without turning around. "No," Garrett said. He stood there another moment. "That smells like something my mother made." She did not respond to that in any elaborate way. "It'll be ready at 6, she said. She heard him leave. At dinner that night, Garrett ate 2 full bowls and asked, in a tone that was almost defensive, whether she'd be making it again. She told him she'd make it again when she had the bones for it. He nodded and looked at his empty bowl like the bowl had said something. The problem with Silas Boone did not resolve itself quickly, and she had not expected it to. He was present at every meal, and he ate at every meal, and he had not, after that first night, actively refused her food or made the kind of scenes she'd been warned about. But he was corrosive in other ways. He said things at the table that were designed to operate at the edge of what she could directly address, comments that weren't quite criticisms of her work, observations that weren't quite insults, questions delivered in a tone that implied the question was actually a verdict. The morning she caught him telling Noah that cooking was not an appropriate thing for a boy to spend time learning, she came close to losing the patience she had been carefully preserving for 6 weeks. She was in the kitchen, and the door between the kitchen and the side hall was not fully closed. She heard Silas's voice, low and certain, the way he always talked, like every sentence had been decided in advance, and then she heard Noah's voice, which had the specific quality of someone trying to be agreeable while also disagreeing, which was a hard balance to strike at 16. She stayed in the kitchen. She finished what she was doing. She thought carefully about the 6 weeks she had put into this situation, and about the things worth spending her restraint on and the things that weren't. Then she went out into the hall. Silas looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the careful blankness of a man who doesn't want to have been caught doing something, but knows he was. "Noah," she said, "the biscuit dough needs folding. Would you go check on it?" Noah went. She looked at Silas. "I understand you have opinions," she said. "Most people do. The boy's time and what he does with it is not your concern, and I'd appreciate it if you let it be." Silas looked at her without expression for a long moment. "I wasn't talking to you," he said. "No," she agreed. "You were talking to him, and now I'm talking to you." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not asking you to like what goes on in my kitchen. I'm asking you to leave it alone." She went back to the kitchen. Silas did not say anything else in the hall. She heard his boots on the floor as he walked back toward the front of the house, and the particular way he walked slower than usual, which she had learned meant he was thinking, told her the conversation was not over, but had been, for the moment, suspended. She was right. It wasn't over, but it had been moved. Caleb Mercer was not a man who talked much about himself, and Eliza had not pushed. She had enough to do without managing the emotional landscape of the man who employed her. But you could not cook for someone for 6 weeks without learning things, and what she learned about Caleb Mercer came mostly from what was absent. He never spoke about his wife. She knew the woman had died 4 winters ago, the way she'd heard it, but in 6 weeks no one at Black Pine had said her name in Eliza's presence. And the house had the quality of a place where something had been deliberately set aside rather than resolved. There were no photographs visible. The front parlor had furniture arranged in a way that seemed like it had once been more inhabited, and had been pared back, piece by piece, until it reached whatever the minimum was. Caleb ate breakfast early and ate it quickly and left before the ranch hands came in. She had adjusted to this without comment, kept something back for him, set it on the small table in the kitchen where he'd sit for 15 minutes before the day took him out the door. They talked sometimes during those 15 minutes. Not about anything personal, about the ranch, about provisions, about the problems that a working ranch generates in continuous supply. But it was conversation that had its own quality, specific and direct, and without the social performance that conversation sometimes was. She noticed that he listened when she talked, not in the pointed way of someone trying to demonstrate attentiveness. Just he listened. He asked follow-up questions that made it clear he had heard the actual thing she'd said rather than his version of it. She noticed this and did not do anything with it. It was an observation, not a decision. One morning in their 5th week, he sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. She was working on bread dough, which required attention but not conversation, and she let the silence run because she'd learned that silence at Black Pine was not usually uncomfortable. "The western pasture fence needs rebuilding," he said. "3rd section. I heard Garrett talking about it," she said. "It's a 2-week job minimum. That's 6 men tied up." She did not ask why he was telling her this. She waited. "Victor Rourke has been making inquiries," Caleb said. He said the name in a tone that was neutral in the specific way that people are neutral about something they've decided not to show feeling about the western boundary. "What kind of inquiries?" "The land survey kind." He was quiet for a moment. "He's got someone looking at the original territorial survey. Claims there's a discrepancy in the boundary marker records." She set down the dough and looked at him. "Is there?" "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "That's the problem." She had heard the name Victor Rourke twice before arriving at Black Pine, and both times in contexts that suggested the kind of man who had accumulated power by being meticulous about other people's vulnerabilities. He owned significant land holdings in the territory, she had heard. Numbers mentioned that she couldn't verify, and he had the reputation of someone who did not move unless he was certain of where he was going to land. "When did this start?" she said. "The inquiries?" 2 weeks ago. Caleb looked at his coffee. "He made an offer on the western pasture 18 months ago. I turned it down. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, apparently not." He picked up his cup, set it down again without drinking. "There's a creek on that land. Seasonal, but it's the only source on the western half of the property that doesn't require pumping. If Rourke gets that pasture, he controls the water access for 3 neighboring spreads in addition to ours." Eliza said nothing for a moment. "You have the original survey documents?" she said. "Somewhere in the sums. My wife managed the paperwork." He stopped. The word wife hung in the kitchen for a moment, in a way that was different from silence. "I haven't gone through the files systematically. I know where they should be." "You should look at them," she said. "I know. Not eventually. Soon." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely classify, somewhere between affronted and reluctantly persuaded. "I'll look at them," he said. He got up from the table, took his cup to the wash basin, and left. She went back to the bread dough. It was Noah who actually found the file. Caleb had mentioned the documents to Eliza as something he intended to locate, And Eliza had let the matter sit for 4 days before she decided that sitting was not producing results and asked Noah if he knew where the household papers were kept. Noah, who knew the geography of the house with the particular thoroughness of a person who had spent a lot of time in a space with nothing pressing to do, thought about it for a moment and said there was a cabinet in the back bedroom, the bedroom that had been Caleb's wife's, and that was now kept closed, that had never been opened in the time he'd been at the ranch. She did not go into that room herself. She went to Caleb and told him what Noah had said, and Caleb's expression shifted in a way she recognized but did not comment on. And 2 evenings later he came to the kitchen with a stack of papers that smelled of dust and closed-in air. "The survey records are in there," he said, "along with everything else. I don't know what you're looking for." "I don't either yet," she said. "Can I look through them?" He set them on the table without ceremony and left. She sat with those papers for 2 evenings. Most of it was household records, land payments, correspondence she skimmed for content and set aside. But the survey documents were there, the original territorial survey from 1871 and the subsequent boundary confirmation from 1879, and a piece of correspondence she almost missed because it had been placed between 2 pages of a water rights record, as if someone had been using it as a bookmark. The letter was from a surveyor named Aldous Crane, dated 1879. And it referred to the western boundary marker in terms that were specific and unambiguous. It mentioned a granite formation. She read the description twice to make sure she was reading it correctly, a permanent rock formation that the survey had used as a reference point, visible from the boundary line. The letter described it in enough detail that it was clearly a permanent landmark, the kind of feature that could not have been moved or misread. Victor Rourke's boundary challenge, from what Caleb had described, depended on the claim that the original boundary markers were ambiguous. If there was a geological reference point that the original survey had explicitly described and documented a formation that still existed, that could still be located, then the ambiguity Rourke was claiming didn't exist. She sat at the table for a while with that letter in her hands. She was not a lawyer, she was not a surveyor. She could read, and she could read carefully, and what she was reading seemed significant. But she understood clearly that she could also be wrong about what she was reading, and that being wrong about this particular thing had real consequences. She folded the letter carefully and set it on top of the other papers. When Caleb came in from the evening rounds, she was still at the table. "I found something," she said. "I think. I'm not certain what it means, but you should look at it." He sat down across from her. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it. She watched his face, which was harder to read than most faces, but which went through something during the reading, a tightening, and then something that was not quite relief and not quite excitement, but was in the territory between them. "Where was this?" he said. "Between 2 pages of the water rights record. I think it was filed with the wrong documents." He read it again. Then he set it down and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, full attention, without the measured quality it usually had. "If this formation is still there," he said slowly, "then the boundary is exactly where it's always been," she said. "And Rourke's claim doesn't have a foundation." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ranch was settling into its evening sounds, the barn, the bunkhouse, the particular quiet of 12 men finding their way toward rest. "I need to talk to a lawyer," Caleb said. "Yes," Eliza said. "You do." Another silence. "You found this," he said. "Not accusatory, just noting it." "The papers were there," she said. "I just read them carefully." He looked at the letter on the table between them. He looked at her. She could not tell precisely what he was thinking, and she was not going to ask. "Thank you," he said. It came out simply, without the performance that gratitude sometimes had. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We don't know what Rourke has." The rhythm of the ranch changed through those weeks in ways that were gradual enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. The kitchen had become a different space from what it had been in December, not just better supplied and better functioning, but different in character. Men who had once taken their meals in the distracted silence of people eating out of necessity began to linger. Conversations that started at the table sometimes continued on the porch. Noah's presence in the kitchen during preparation had shifted from something the hands ignored to something they'd occasionally comment on, usually in the form of some man saying something like, "Boy, what she got you making today?" and Noah answering with the particular directness he'd developed, which Eliza recognized as a learned behavior rather than a natural one. Silas Boone still sat at the far end of the table. He still maintained his silence with the discipline of someone who had made a decision and was sticking to it. But the silence had changed in quality. It was no longer the silence of someone holding a position. Exactly. It was more like the silence of someone who has stopped arguing, but has not yet figured out what to do with the absence of the argument. One evening after dinner, Eliza was at the wash basin when she heard boots stop in the kitchen doorway. She did not look up. "That thing you did with the cornmeal," Silas said. "Tonight, the skillet cake," she said. "Yeah," a pause. "My mother made something like that." She finished what she was doing. She dried her hands. She turned around. Silas Boone was standing in the doorway with an expression that clearly wanted to look like it had no feelings in it, and just as clearly did not succeed. "What did she put in it?" Eliza said. "Honey," he said, when she had it. And sometimes he stopped. "Sometimes what?" "Dried fruit." He said it like he was admitting something. "Apple," she said. "Peach mostly." He was quiet. "She died when I was 12. Eliza looked at him, not with sympathy that wanted to perform itself, just with attention that the moment required. "That's a long time to eat other people's cooking," she said. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't a smile. Silas Boone, she suspected, had not smiled freely in a long time. But it was something in that direction. "It is," he said. He left. She heard his boots on the floor down the hallway, and the particular slowness of them had changed from the thoughtful deliberateness of earlier weeks into something else that she couldn't quite name. She turned off the lamp over the wash basin and went to the small table where she'd left the water rights records she was still working through, because the Creek survey reference in Aldous Crane's letter had mentioned a second document she had not yet located, and she was beginning to think it might be somewhere in the stack she hadn't fully examined. She found it 20 minutes later, a field note, handwritten, with a description of the granite formation from the surveyor's own direct observation. It was in better condition than the letter, and it was specific enough that a person who went to the location could find what it described without ambiguity. She set it next to Crane's letter and looked at the two documents side by side. If Rourke was planning to challenge the western boundary, he was going to do it on the argument that the original markers were unclear. These two documents together made that argument considerably harder to make. Not impossible, she knew enough about the way these things worked to know that Rourke had resources she didn't fully understand, and lawyers who were paid to find angles. But harder, she needed to tell Caleb about the field note in the morning. She also needed, she realized, to think carefully about something she had been not thinking about for several weeks with increasing deliberateness. The care she put into finding those documents. The way she had sat with those papers for 2 evenings, not because it was her job, but because it mattered. The way the creek and the western pasture and Caleb Mercer's future on this land had become things she thought about, as though they were partly her concern. They weren't technically. She was the cook. She had been here 6 weeks. She had a room off the back hallway with a mattress that had seen better decades, and $4.60 still sitting in her coat pocket because she had not yet spent it on anything, and she did not own a single thing in this house or on this land. She looked at the two documents on the table. Then she put them carefully in the folder with the other survey records, turned out the lamp, and went to bed. She told Caleb about the field note at 5:15 in the morning, before the ranch was awake, while the coffee was still making its first sounds, and the kitchen held the particular cold of early Montana spring. He read it standing up, the way a person reads something when they're too focused to bother sitting down. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression she was beginning, slowly, and with some caution, to understand. "We need to go to the western boundary," he said, "to see if the formation is still there." "Yes," she said. "Can you ride?" She had not ridden in 2 years. "Well enough," she said, which was an honest answer if you interpreted well enough generously. He looked at her for a moment. "Saturday," he said. "I'll take you out there Saturday." She nodded and went back to the stove. It was, she thought, a practical arrangement. They needed to verify the information. The information was about the land. The land was what mattered. That was what she told herself, standing at the stove in the early morning quiet of a kitchen that had become, without her fully deciding it should, the place at Black Pine she thought of as hers. Saturday came with the kind of sky that couldn't decide what it wanted. Low gray clouds pulling apart in the west, patches of pale light breaking through, and strips that moved across the land and were gone. Eliza had been up before 4. She'd left biscuits wrapped in cloth on the kitchen table for Noah to manage, written out instructions in the margins of the flour sack paper because she didn't have anything better to write on, and was standing in the yard when Caleb came out of the house with 2 horses already saddled. She had not asked who saddled them. She assumed he had, which meant he'd been up before her, which she filed away without comment. The ride to the western boundary took the better part of an hour. The land changed as they moved away from the ranch buildings opened up, lost the organized quality that human habitation gives a landscape, and became something older and less interested in them. The grass was still winter pale in the low places. The creek, when they crossed it at the shallow ford, ran cold and clear and faster than she'd expected for late spring. Caleb didn't talk much on the ride, which suited her. She was managing the horse, which was named Fletcher, and had opinions about the footing near the creek, that she respected by giving him his head. She was also thinking about the field note, which she had read so many times in the last 4 days that she could have recited the surveyor's description of the granite formation from memory. A natural outcropping, Aldous Crane had written in 1879, rising approximately 12 feet at the highest point, consisting of 3 primary faces oriented south-southwest, distinctive striating along the eastern face, consistent with regional geological formations. Used as fixed reference point for boundary determination permanent feature, not subject to seasonal change or human alteration. 12 feet, 3 faces, striating on the east, she was watching the ridge line when Caleb stopped his horse. There, he said. She looked where he was looking, and the formation was exactly where the field note said it would be. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a shelf of dark granite rising out of the hillside at an angle, split into 3 visible sections by the particular way the stone had fractured over whatever span of years geology operated on. The eastern face had visible striating bands of slightly lighter rock running in rough parallels through the darker stone, the kind of thing that looks unremarkable until you know to look for it and then looks exactly like itself. She climbed down from Fletcher and walked to the base of it. She put her hand against the rock, cold and solid, with the rough texture of something that had been exactly where it was for centuries and intended to remain so. It's the same formation, she said. Yes, Caleb said. He'd dismounted too, and was standing a few feet from her, looking at the rock and then at the lay of the land around it. The boundary line runs from this point northeast to the creek bend and then follows the water. He paused. Rourke's claim puts the boundary 70 yards south of here. 70 yards. She turned and looked south. The land in that direction was flat pasture land for a stretch, and then rose toward the ridge where the creek's source came down. If the boundary were pushed 70 yards south, Rourke would get the formation, the water access point, and the flat grazing land between them. He can't claim ambiguity with this standing here, she said. His lawyer will argue that the survey record is unclear about which formation it references, Caleb said. That there might be another rock formation that was the original reference point. Is there? Not that I've ever seen on this land. He was quiet for a moment. But I'm not an impartial witness. I own the land. She understood what he meant. A man claiming there was no other formation on land he owned was a man with an obvious reason to say so. What they needed was someone who had seen this land before Rourke's challenge began, someone whose account existed outside this dispute. Walter Crowe, she said. Caleb looked at her. He told me he's been riding this range since before you bought the property, she said. He said 15 years. That puts him here before the 1,879 survey confirmation. Walter's my oldest hand, Caleb said slowly. His word carries weight. Then get his account in writing. Get it notarized if there's any way to manage it. She looked at the formation again. And photograph this, before anything else happens. Caleb studied her for a long moment with the expression she'd been trying to figure out for weeks, the one that wasn't measuring her exactly, but wasn't quite something else either. You've thought about this more than I have, he said. I've had less to do in the evenings than you have, she said, which was not entirely accurate but was easier than the real answer. She got back on Fletcher. The horse accepted her without drama. They rode back toward the ranch in the same companionable silence they'd ridden out in. Though the quality of it had changed, it had something in it now, some awareness of the shared thing they'd confirmed, that sat differently than plain quiet. She'd not examined that too closely. There was too much else to manage. The rumors started 11 days later. She found out the way most things found their way to her through Noah, who heard things and reported them with the straightforward neutrality of a 16-year-old who had not yet developed the adult habit of deciding what information other people needed. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning looking like he wanted to say something and wasn't certain he should. Whatever it is, Eliza said. Without turning from the stove, you might as well say it. Noah was quiet for a moment. I heard something in town yesterday. When I went with Garrett for the feed, she waited. There's talk, he said, about you and Mr. Mercer. She set down the wooden spoon she'd been using. What kind of talk, she said, though she had already understood what kind. Noah's face had the particular misery of someone delivering news they didn't make. That you came here knowing him before, that you came on purpose because of the land trouble, that maybe he stopped, that maybe he's not thinking clearly about the land situation because of me, she said. Yes, Noah said quietly. She stood very still for a moment. She understood the mechanism, had understood it in the abstract, since Caleb had told her about Rourke's inquiries. A man who wanted to win a legal dispute had 2 options, make his own case stronger or make his opponent's weaker. And making Caleb's case weaker, when the evidence was not cooperating, meant making Caleb's judgment look compromised. And who had found the survey documents? Who had identified the field note? who had gone out to verify the formation and come back with a clear account that supported Caleb's position on every point. The cook, the young woman from nowhere who had shown up 6 weeks after the previous cook left and inserted herself. There was a word she didn't let herself use for it, but she could hear how the story was being told in town, into the business of the ranch, in ways that went considerably beyond the kitchen. How widespread is it? She said. I don't know, Noah said. Garrett heard it at the feed store. The man behind the counter said it, not like gossip, like something he'd been told. Told, not heard floating around. Told specifically by someone who wanted it transmitted. She picked up the wooden spoon and went back to the stove. Thank you for telling me, she said. What are you going to do? Noah said. I'm going to finish breakfast, she said. And then I'm going to think about it. She thought about it through breakfast preparation, and through serving, and through the dishes. She thought about it with the particular quality of thinking she reserved for problems that required her to set aside how she felt about them and consider only what would actually work. What would work was not obvious. The rumor was designed with some care. It couldn't be directly disproven without appearing to protest too much, and protesting too much would read as confirmation. The relationship between a female employee and a widower employer was the kind of thing that people in small towns in 1887 had strong and settled opinions about, and those opinions did not require evidence to sustain themselves. What she knew was this: Victor Rourke had started this story somewhere. The feed store man had been told it deliberately, by someone who wanted it moving through the community, before Caleb's lawyer had a chance to formally present the survey evidence. And the story was not just gossip, it was strategy. She went to find Caleb after breakfast. He was in the barn, which was where he went when he was working through something difficult. She had figured that out in the first 2 weeks. He was checking the condition of a fence post section that had come in the previous day, running his hand along the grain of the wood in the absent way of a man whose attention was elsewhere. She told him what Noah had told her. He listened without interrupting. His expression did not change dramatically, but she had learned to read the smaller shifts, the tightening around his eyes, the particular set of his jaw that meant he was containing something he had a feeling about. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Rourke, he said. It wasn't a question. That would be my assessment, she said. It's too timed. It started moving through town the week after we filed the preliminary survey response with the territorial office. Caleb set down the fence post section and turned to face her fully. This is going to get worse before it gets better, he said. Probably, she said. If you want to, he started. Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't tell me I have the option to leave, she said. I know I have the option. I'm not leaving. I just need to know what you want to do about it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't try to classify. What are the choices, he said. We could say nothing and let it run its course, she said, which gives it space to grow. Or we could address it directly, which means going into town together, publicly, and not behaving like people who have something to hide. Going into town together isn't going to stop people from talking, he said. No, she said, but it stops us from letting them dictate how we move. If we avoid being seen together in public because of what people are saying, we've already conceded something. He thought about that for a moment. Saturday, he said, there's a meeting at the Harlow Creek Town Hall about the water rights survey. 3 or 4 other ranchers will be there. I was going to go alone. Take me with you, she said. Not as your cook. As someone who has read the survey documents and knows the land in question. He looked at her for a long moment. That will make the talk worse in the short term, he said. Probably, she agreed, but it makes our position clearer. Rourke's strategy is to make you look like a man who's not thinking straight. Walking into that meeting with someone who clearly is thinking straight is one answer to that. It was quiet again. She could see him working through it, not just the tactical question, but something else. Something more personal that he was navigating around the edges of. All right, he said finally. Saturday, she nodded and left the barn. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, with her hands flat on the surface, and breathed. She was not as steady as she'd appeared in the barn. The anger had been there, since Noah had told her. A cold, focused anger at the specific mechanics of what Rourke was doing. At the way this particular kind of attack was designed to make a woman's competence look like manipulation. She was angry at the architecture of it. But angry was not useful in the way she needed to be useful. She had learned over years to put the anger somewhere it could be accessed, but not displayed like a fire in a firebox, generating heat without burning the structure around it. She had work to do. She went back to work. Walter Crowe was 61 years old and had the quality of a man who had been doing the same hard thing for so long that the hardness had become simply his natural state. The way a river stone is smooth, not because it was made smooth, but because everything else wore away. He had come to Black Pine when it was still early in its life as a working ranch, hired on by the previous owner, stayed when Caleb bought the property, and continued because the alternative, doing something else at 61, seemed to him worse than whatever was difficult about where he already was. He had never been warm toward Eliza exactly, but he had never been like Silas either. He ate what she put in front of him, said nothing about it one way or the other, and had once, during a week when she had been working with the bread, twice daily trying to get the hydration right with the flour she had, said only this one's better about a loaf that she had privately been satisfied with. She went to find him the afternoon after she spoke to Caleb in the barn. He was near the north fence with two other hands, and she waited until he was separating from them before she approached. "Walter," she said, "I need to talk to you about the western boundary." He stopped. He looked at her with the particular caution of a man who has learned not to be surprised but still is, occasionally. "What about it?" he said. "You've been riding this range since before Mr. Mercer bought the property," she said. 15 years, you told me. 16, he said. "Do you know the granite formation? At the western boundary marker?" He looked at her for a moment. "I know the rock," he said. "Have you ever, in 16 years, seen any other large formation on that land that could be mistaken for a boundary marker?" Walter was quiet. She could see him thinking, actually thinking, not performing thought. "No," he said. "There's no other rock like that on the western half. Not on this property. Would you be willing to put that in writing?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "This is about Rourke's claim." Yes, he was quiet again longer this time. She did not rush him. Men like Walter did not respond well to being rushed. "Caleb know you're asking me this," he said. "He knows I was going to," she said. "He agrees it's worth getting your account down." Another pause. He turned and looked out across the land in the direction of the western boundary, though it was too far to see from where they stood. "He's been trying to take pieces of this land for 3 years," Walter said. "Not just here. The Hendersons had trouble with him. The Becker family." He stopped. "This isn't about the creek." "No," Eliza agreed, "it isn't." He looked back at her. "I'll put it in writing," he said. "I'll need someone to help me with the legal language." "I can help with that," she said. He nodded once, which was apparently the end of the conversation from his side, and went back to the fence. She let out a slow breath as she walked back toward the house. Walter Crow's testimony was not a complete solution, but it was a piece, and pieces were what they had. The Saturday meeting in Harlow Creek was held in the town hall, which was a single room that smelled of old wood and a winter's worth of inadequate heating. 8 men were already there when Eliza and Caleb walked in, and the quality of the silence that followed their entrance was specific and distinct, not hostile exactly, but charged the way air feels before weather. She had put on her better dress, which was not dramatically better than her everyday one, but which was clean and pressed and conveyed a kind of deliberateness. She had also, before they left the ranch, made a decision about how she was going to carry herself in that room, not deferentially, not aggressively, just with the plain confidence of a person who was there because she had reason to be. Caleb greeted the men by name. Some of them greeted him back with the ease of long familiarity. Others had a quality she recognized, the managed neutrality of people who had heard a story and hadn't decided what to do with it yet. One of them, a rancher named Phipps, whose property bordered the southern edge of Black Pine, looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but that asked a question he wasn't going to say out loud. Caleb introduced her matter-of-factly, Eliza Hartwell. "She's been working through the original survey records. She knows the land in question." A few of the men looked at each other in the way that meant something was being communicated without words. She let it happen. She stood where she was and waited for the meeting to begin. It was run by a man named Aldrich, who was the nearest thing Harlow Creek had to a civic administrator, and it covered several water rights questions related to the spring survey season. Rourke's challenge to Black Pine's western boundary was not officially on the agenda, but it was present in the room the way things are present when several people are thinking about the same thing. 40 minutes in, a man she didn't know said something that was not quite about the meeting's official subject. "I heard Rourke has a survey expert coming from Helena," the man said. "Someone who's looked at the 1,871 records." "We're aware of that," Caleb said. "That Helena man's supposed to say the original boundary wasn't clearly fixed," the man continued. He was not looking at Eliza, but she understood that what he said next was meant to be about her in some way. That the records weren't kept reliably. "The records were kept reliably," Eliza said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She had known they would, and she had been ready for it. She spoke without raising her voice and without any particular heat. "There are 2 documents in the original survey file, a letter from the surveyor and a field note from the same survey that describe the western boundary marker by specific geological features. The formation is still there. We verified it in person 2 weeks ago." The room was quiet. "Those documents have been in the Black Pine files since 1879, she said. "They weren't recently prepared, and they weren't recently found by accident." They were filed with the survey record, and they've been there since the survey was conducted. Phipps, the rancher from the southern property, was looking at her with an expression that had shifted from its earlier careful neutrality toward something more engaged. How specific, he said. Specific enough that a person who went to the western boundary with that field note could locate the exact formation described without ambiguity, she said. Height, orientation, and geological features. All of it matches. Another silence. She could feel the room processing this not uniformly, not all in the same direction, but processing it. Caleb said nothing during any of this. She was aware of the fact that he was letting her speak, not stepping in to clarify or rephrase or moderate. He was trusting what she said, because he had been there when she found the documents and had ridden out to the formation himself. That trust, sitting quietly beside her in that room, was not something she examined in the moment. She was too busy watching the faces around the table. The man who had raised the Helena surveyor did not say anything else about it. The meeting concluded an hour later, and as people stood and moved toward the door, Phipps stopped beside Caleb and said, in a low voice that Eliza could hear, "If Rourke's got a legal man from Helena, you need a lawyer who knows territorial survey law. I can give you a name. I'd appreciate that," Caleb said. Phipps looked at Eliza briefly, with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but that seemed, on balance, like it might be respect or at least the beginning of it. She did not let herself feel too satisfied about that. They were a long way from the end of this. Walking out of the town hall, she was aware of being watched. Not dramatically, just the particular quality of a small-town public space when a story is being confirmed or revised in real time. She walked beside Caleb at a natural pace and did not look around for who was watching. What she had not expected was Martin Dunbar. He was outside the general store as they passed, and he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he dismissed in the morning and who has since become, in the estimation of people he respects, a different kind of person than he decided she was. It was not a comfortable look to receive or to give, and he managed it by looking slightly past her rather than directly at her. She did not stop. She did not say anything to him. Some things were more satisfying left alone. The day the letter arrived from Rourke's lawyer was a Wednesday, which became important in the telling later, not because Wednesday had any particular significance, but because it was the day Noah had burned the bottom layer of the morning's cornbread by being distracted, and Eliza had been in the middle of trying to explain that the sound the butter makes in the pan is actually information when Caleb came into the kitchen with an envelope and a specific quality of stillness. She looked at him. "Formal offer," he said, "or the threat that comes with one." He set the letter on the table. She didn't read it without being invited to, but he pushed it toward her, which she took as an invitation. The language was legal in its formality, but its meaning was plain. Rourke's position was that the western boundary had never been definitively established, that his own survey expert would demonstrate this to the territorial court, and that given the cost and uncertainty of litigation, he was prepared to offer Caleb a generous settlement. The letter called it in exchange for a formal transfer of 40 acres along the western edge, including the creek access point. 40 acres the creek. She set the letter down. "He knows about the formation," she said. Caleb looked at her. "This offer exists because he knows the formation documentation weakens his boundary claim," she said. "If he were confident in his legal position, he wouldn't be settling. He'd be proceeding straight to court. Or he wants to save time," Caleb said. "A man like Rourke doesn't settle to save time. He settles when the time cost is less than the risk of losing." She paused. "He's not certain he can win. So he's trying to get what he can before the court rules." Caleb was quiet. Noah, who had been standing very still near the stove since the letter arrived, said nothing. He had developed a quality over the last weeks, an ability to be present in difficult moments without making them harder that she thought was not inborn but acquired. "The creek access affects the whole western operation," Caleb said. "Without it, we'd have to pump water to the western grazing land. That's manageable in summer. It's not manageable in winter when the pump lines freeze." "I know," she said. "Rourke knows it too," Caleb said. "He's not taking that land for cattle. He's taken it to control water access. If he owns the creek point on this property, he controls what 3 other ranches can negotiate for their own water rights." She had worked this out already, but hearing him say it confirmed it. "Then refusing is about more than black pine," she said. "It's about every operation on this side of the ridge," Caleb said. "If Rourke gets the creek access, he can make it expensive enough that 2 or 3 of those spreads either sell to him or go under. That's how he operates. He doesn't take one thing. He takes one thing and then uses it to take everything adjacent." She looked at the letter again. She looked at Caleb. His face had the quality of a man who has already made his decision, but is running through the weight of it one more time, out of fairness to the decision. "You're going to refuse," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then we need Walter's written account notarized before Rourke can move to delay the process," she said. And we need to find Phipps's lawyer. I'll write to him today. She nodded. She looked at Noah, who was still standing by the stove with the quiet attention of a person who has understood everything that was just said and is holding it carefully. The cornbread, she said to him. He looked at the pan, which had a burned section along one side that was not salvageable. I know, he said. Scrape the burned part, she said. The rest is fine. People have eaten worse. He nodded and went back to work. She went to the table and picked up the letter. She folded it along its original creases and handed it back to Caleb. Write the refusal today, she said. Don't give him the weekend to move on something else while you're deciding. Caleb took the letter. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with it in his hand, looking at her with the expression she had decided finally to stop trying to classify and simply accept as a form of regard she did not have language for. All right, he said, and left. The 2 weeks that followed were the kind that compress in memory later, too many pieces moving simultaneously to reconstruct in sequence. The lawyer Phipps recommended, a man named Edvard Holst, who practiced in the territorial capital, received Caleb's summary and wrote back within a week with a list of evidence requirements and a date for the preliminary hearing that was closer than any of them had expected. Walter Crow's account was written out with Eliza's help at the kitchen table. On a Sunday evening, Noah sitting at the far end doing his own work, and it took 3 hours to get it into a form that was both accurate and legally usable. Walter had the memory of a man who had paid close attention to the land. For 16 years he could describe the formation, the surrounding topography, the location of the creek in relation to the boundary point, in enough detail that his account was not merely confirmatory but independently descriptive. A man who had never seen Aldous Crane's field note and described the same formation in the same terms was a more powerful witness than one whose account tracked an existing document too closely. She pointed this out to Walter when they were finalizing the draft, and he looked at her with the particular look she'd come to associate with his versions of approval, a slight narrowing of the eyes, and then nothing, as though the acknowledgement had been given, and the moment closed. Holst's first formal response to Rourke's legal team arrived on a Thursday. Caleb read it at the kitchen table in the early morning and passed it to Eliza without comment. She read it twice, because Holst's language was precise in ways she wanted to make sure she followed, and then she sat with it for a moment. The response was essentially a dismantlement. It identified the Crane letter and the field note, referenced Walter's notarized account, noted the physical verification of the formation, and concluded with a paragraph that Eliza thought was particularly well constructed. It did not say Rourke was lying, but it said, in language that was unambiguous to anyone who read carefully, that his survey expert's claims would not survive contact with the physical evidence. Holst is good, she said. He should be, at what he charges, Caleb said, without much heat. She set the letter down. She picked up her coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the first gray of dawn was becoming something lighter. Rourke's going to respond to this by escalating, she said. Yes, Caleb said. He's going to do something before the hearing. Something to undermine the evidence or the people who found it. Caleb looked at her. You sound certain. A man who's already spread rumors through the town feed store before we even filed the preliminary response doesn't stop when the legal counter-argument arrives, she said. He has too much invested in this. He's been building toward the creek access for 3 years. He won't just accept that the evidence doesn't support him. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What do you think he'll do? She thought about it honestly. I don't know specifically, she said. But I think he'll come here. The words sat in the kitchen between them. Here, Caleb repeated. He'll want to see what he's dealing with in person, she said. And he'll want to see if there's something he can use that he hasn't found yet. She paused. He'll come with an offer or a threat, and he'll want to deliver it in a way that's harder to refuse than a letter. Caleb looked at his coffee. She could see him thinking about what that meant about a man like Rourke, sitting across a table from him on his own land. Let him come, Caleb said finally. She looked at him. If he comes here, at least I know what he's saying, he said. And what he's not, she nodded. That was the right logic. Whatever Fork said in person, a man like him had the quality of showing his position in the gap between what he offered and what he wanted would be visible in whatever he thought he could get away with asking for. She began clearing the table. Eliza, Caleb said. She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression she had finally accepted as something she did not need to explain to herself. What you found in those papers, he said, and what you've done with it since. He stopped. There was a quality in how he stopped, not inability to continue, but deliberateness about where to stop. The ranch needed the documents to be found, she said. That's not what I was going to say, he said. She looked at him. He looked back, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet and very still, and the gray light through the window had become the early gold of actual morning, the kind of light that changes how everything in a room looks, edges softer, shadows smaller, every surface less harsh than it was in the dark. The men, he said, changing course with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided he's not ready yet, are going to need to know what's at stake. Before Rourke comes, they should hear it from me. She held what he'd changed course from without letting it show. Yes, she said, they should. She finished clearing the table. She heard him leave the kitchen, heard his boots down the hall, heard the particular sound of the front door as he went out into the morning to find his hands. She stood at the wash basin for a moment with her hands in the water, which was cold and which was a useful thing to be doing when you were trying to maintain your composure about something you hadn't admitted to yourself yet. She was in this. She had been in this for weeks, not as an employee and not as a bystander. She was in it the way you're in something when it has become, without your fully deciding it should, part of what you wake up thinking about. The land, the creek, the men around the table, the survey letter folded in the file with the water rights records, the way he'd stopped himself and changed course. She dried her hands and went back to the stove. Rourke would come. She was certain of that. And when he did, whatever she had been managing to pretend she hadn't yet figured out about her own situation would matter considerably more than it did right now. She added wood to the firebox. The stove ran clean and level since Arn had fixed it, and she was still not entirely used to that. Still checked the damper out of habit from the weeks of careful management, and began measuring out the flour for the noon bread. Outside, she could hear Caleb's voice in the yard, the low, carrying tone of a man addressing people he was responsible for. She could not hear the words, but she could hear the quality of it. Steady. Certain. The voice of a man who had decided something and was living inside the decision. She worked the flour into the dough, pressed and folded, counted her breaths the way she always did when her hands were busy and her mind was moving faster than was useful, and let the morning do what mornings do. Rourke came on a Friday. She had predicted he would come, but she had not predicted the particular way he arrived, not alone, not with lawyers, but with two men she didn't recognize who had the specific quality of men hired to be present rather than to do anything specific. They rode into the yard at mid-morning when half the ranch hands were out on the range, and the other half were near the barn working on equipment. Caleb was in the house reviewing correspondence with a copy of Holt's most recent letter. Eliza was in the kitchen. She heard the horses. She looked out the window. Victor Rourke was not what she had constructed in her mind, which was a thing she noted without surprise. The people you build up from reputation almost never match what you find. He was in his mid-50s, heavyset in the particular way of a man who had been physically powerful once and had since acquired wealth as a substitute for the effort. He dressed well better than the occasion required for a ranch visit which she understood was deliberate. He wanted to come in, looking like a man who had already won and was doing the other party the courtesy of informing them. He did not look at the kitchen window. He looked at the house. She dried her hands and went to find Caleb. He was already moving toward the front door when she reached the hallway. He had heard the horses too. Rourke, she said. I know, he said. He brought men. I see them. He stopped at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked at her with a steadiness she recognized as the product of effort rather than ease. You don't need to be part of this. I know I don't, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then opened the door and walked out onto the porch. She stayed in the doorway. That was a position she had chosen deliberately present, visible, but not inserting herself into the opening of the conversation. There was a difference between being there and making an entrance, and she understood it. Rourke dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to arriving places and having people adjust to him. He looked at Caleb on the porch with an expression that was almost friendly, the social warmth of someone who wants you to believe the conversation is going to be reasonable before it turns out not to be. Caleb, he said, I thought it was time we talked in person. You could have sent a letter, Caleb said. Rourke smiled. Letters are for lawyers. I prefer to handle things man to man when I can. He looked around the yard at the barn, at the men near the equipment who had stopped working and were watching, at the house. His eyes moved to the doorway where Eliza was standing and stayed there for a moment before coming back to Caleb. Your cook, he said. My employee, Caleb said. Rourke walked toward the porch steps with the air of someone who had been invited, which he hadn't. Can we talk inside? We can talk here, Caleb said. A pause. Rourke absorbed this without visible reaction, which told her something. A man who reacts to not getting small concessions is a man who was counting on them. Rourke had not been counting on it. Fair enough, Rourke said. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at Caleb in a way that was calculated. It put Caleb physically higher, which should have been a position of authority, but Rourke's posture managed to make it look like Caleb was the one keeping a careful distance. She had to acknowledge privately and with considerable displeasure that he was skilled at this. My offer still stands, Rourke said. 40 acres at the creek access point. I'll pay market value plus 15%. That's a generous number, Caleb, and I think you know it. I refuse the offer in writing, Caleb said, through counsel. Through counsel. Rourke repeated it with a mild amusement that was meant to make the word sound faintly ridiculous. A lot of expense for a boundary dispute that could be settled over a handshake. He paused. The hearing's in 6 weeks. Holst is good, I'll give you that, but my man from Helena has been doing survey work for 20 years. He'll find things in those 1,871 records that nobody's looked at carefully. He'll find what's there, Caleb said, nothing else. That's an optimistic reading of how these things go. Rourke's tone shifted slightly, still pleasant on the surface, but with something underneath it that had an edge. Litigation is expensive. It's slow, and it draws attention in ways that aren't always comfortable. He paused just long enough. For everyone involved. The everyone involved landed in the yard with a specific weight, and she understood immediately that it was for her benefit as much as Caleb's. She stayed in the doorway. She did not move or change her expression. Caleb said, "You've been drawing attention in your own ways. The story's moving through Harlow Creek." Rourke looked surprised or performed surprise, which was its own kind of information. "I wouldn't know anything about local gossip," he said. Caleb said, "You wouldn't." A brief silence. One of the men near the barn, Garrett, she could tell from the posture, had set down his tools entirely and was standing watching with no particular attempt to look like he wasn't. Rourke tried a different angle. He looked toward the doorway, directly at Eliza this time, with the deliberate quality of someone making a point without stating it. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "you've been quite involved in all of this." She said nothing. "I understand you found some documents," Rourke continued, his tone conversational, "in the household files." He paused, as though choosing the word carefully, quite a contribution. For a cook. She held the doorframe and looked at him with the same steady attention she would give a stove that was behaving in a way she didn't trust yet. "Those documents were in the survey file where they belonged," she said. "Anyone who looked for them would have found them." "But not everyone looked," Rourke said. He smiled not warmly, but with the particular pleasantness of a man delivering something sharp in a pleasant package. "Interesting, isn't it, that the person who found them is someone with, how should I put it, a personal stake in how things turn out here." She felt Caleb shift on the porch beside her and spoke before he could. "I have a wage," she said. "That's my stake. I found documents that were filed in the wrong section of the household papers, read them carefully, and understood what they meant. The fact that they help the case doesn't make them different documents than they are." She paused. "You're welcome to have your surveyman look at the originals. They're exactly what they appear to be." Rourke looked at her for a moment with an expression that had dropped some of its pleasantness. "You're confident," he said. "About those documents, yes," she said. "About the formation at the western boundary, yes. About Walter Crow's 16 years of direct knowledge of this land, yes." She kept her voice even. "I'm less confident about some things, but those particular things I am." A silence stretched across the yard. She was aware of having said more than she'd planned to. She was also aware that she didn't regret it. Rourke looked from her to Caleb. His expression had settled into something more careful, the look of a man recalculating. "The offer's open until the end of the month," he said to Caleb. "After that, we go to the hearing, and whatever the court decides, it decides." He let that sit for a moment. "Think about it carefully. A man running a ranch this size needs his attention on the work, not on legal proceedings." "I've thought about it," Caleb said. "The answer is no." Rourke nodded slowly, as though this were the answer he'd expected and was already managing. He looked once more at the yard, at Garrett still watching from the barn, at the other hands who had drifted into visibility in the way of people who were present without quite announcing themselves. He turned and walked back to his horse. One of his men held the reins while he mounted, and she thought that said something, though she couldn't have articulated precisely what. A man who requires other people to hold his horse when he's capable of holding it himself has a particular relationship to being served. They rode out of the yard without looking back. The yard was quiet for a moment after they left. Then Garrett picked up his tools and went back to work, which was the signal for the other men to do the same. And the ordinary sounds of the ranch resumed, not loudly, not with the relaxed quality of a normal morning, but they resumed. Caleb turned and looked at Eliza. She was still in the doorway. Her hand had tightened on the frame during the last part of the conversation, and she made herself release it. "You shouldn't have spoken," Caleb said. His tone was not angry. It was the tone of a man saying something he felt obligated to say, even though he wasn't sure he meant it entirely. "He directed a question to me," she said. "He directed it to bait me." "I know," she said. "And if I'd stayed quiet, it would have looked like what he was suggesting was true, that I have something to hide about how those documents were found." She looked at him steadily. Staying quiet was the wrong response to that particular move. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the road where Rourke had gone. "He's going to use what you said," he said. "He'll find a way." "He was going to use something," she said. "That's what he came here to gather." something he could use. She paused. What I said is on the record, and it's the truth. The truth is harder to use against us than silence would have been. He looked at her with the complicated expression she had stopped trying to fully decode. You believe that? Yes, she said, and I think you do too, or you'd have stopped me. He hadn't stopped her. That was a fact that sat between them without either of them stating it directly. Come inside, he said. I need to write to Holst today. She sat at the kitchen table while he wrote, not because she needed to be there, but because it had become, by some gradual and unannounced process, the right place to be when there was something being worked through. She made coffee and set his cup within reach, worked through the week's pantry inventory while he drafted the letter, and neither of them made anything of the ease of it. He described Rourke's visit accurately and without embellishment. He noted the offer, noted the refusal, noted the comments about the survey evidence. He paused when he got to the part about Eliza. He made a specific suggestion about you, Caleb said, in front of witnesses. I should document that. Yes, she said. That means putting it formally in the letter. I understand what it means, she said. He wrote it. She heard the scratch of the pen and did not look up from the inventory list. When he'd sealed the letter, he set it aside and picked up his coffee, which had gone somewhat cold. He didn't seem to notice. He's not going to stop, Caleb said. No, she agreed. But he's showing us where his weaknesses are, he said. Every move he makes tells us something about what he's actually worried about. She looked up from the list. He didn't expect me to answer him. No, Caleb said. He expected me to answer for you, or to tell you to be quiet, which would have made me look either defensive or controlling, depending on which direction he wanted to take it. He paused. You removed both options. She held that for a moment. I didn't plan it that carefully. I know, he said. That's probably why it worked. She looked at him. He looked back. Noah came in from the side door at that moment with a question about the afternoon bread, and the moment redistributed itself into ordinary kitchen logistics. But it had existed, and they both knew it had. The week that followed Rourke's visit had a quality she had not experienced at Black Pine before a collective holding of breath. The ranch hands knew something had happened. They'd seen Rourke in the yard, and those who hadn't seen him had been told by those who had. The information moved through the bunkhouse the way information moves through any enclosed community, quickly and with additions. Silas Boone came to the kitchen that evening. She was finishing the dinner cleanup. Noah had gone to bed early. He'd been fighting a head cold for 3 days, and she'd finally told him the kitchens would survive without him for one night. The house was quiet in the particular way it was when Caleb was in his office doing accounts. Silas stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. He always wore the hat or left it somewhere. He did not stand in doorways holding it. Rourke's going to try to pressure some of the hands, Silas said. I heard it today. He's got a man who's been talking to Garrett's cousin in Millhaven, offering work, better pay. She set down the cloth she'd been using and looked at him. To take the hands away before the hearing, she said. Some of them, Silas said. Maybe to depose someone. Maybe just to reduce the crew, so Caleb's got less stability going into it. He was quiet for a moment. Garrett told his cousin no. But not everyone's going to. Who, she said. Pete Larson's been unhappy since March, Silas said. Nobody's talked to him directly, but he's been approached. She had learned Pete Larson across 5 months of daily meals, which was its own kind of knowledge, not deep, but specific. He was in his late 20s, capable, and had the particular restlessness of a man whose complaints were real, but whose proposed solutions were vague. He had complained twice in her presence about the ranch's long-term prospects. She had not assigned much weight to it because complaining was a common feature of working men and did not always mean anything. But if Rourke had found him, does Caleb know, she said. Not yet, Silas said. I came to you first. She looked at him. The hat in his hands, the directness of his posture, which had a quality she had not seen from him, before something that was not quite vulnerable but was in the general area. Why me first, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Because you'll know how to tell him without making it worse, he said. It came out plainly, without the defensive quality that had characterized most of his early communications with her. Just said. She held that for a moment. I'll talk to Caleb tonight, she said. Thank you for telling me. He nodded and put his hat back on and left. She heard his boots on the porch, still slower than they used to be, but the slowness had a different quality now. Less like a man holding a position, more like a man who'd set something down. Caleb's response to the information about Pete Larson was not what she'd expected, which had taught her by this point to stop having expectations about his responses. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him, sitting in the chair at his desk, with the lamp making the room feel smaller than it was. Pete's not a bad hand, he said. I know, she said. He has a right to go work somewhere else if he wants to, Caleb said. Yes, she said. But if he's going because Rourke is paying him to, or paying his cousin to talk him into it, that's a different thing than leaving on his own terms. I can't keep a man here who doesn't want to stay, Caleb said. and I won't try. No, she said, but you can talk to him, not to pressure him. Just to make sure he knows the situation clearly. He may not know what Rourke's actual goal is. Caleb looked at her. You think he doesn't know? I think Pete Larson is unhappy about his prospects here, and someone is offering him a better-sounding alternative, she said. That's not the same as understanding that he's being used to destabilize a ranch before a court hearing. He might not have made that connection. Caleb was quiet for a moment. And if I talk to him and he decides to leave anyway? Then he leaves, she said. And you're down a hand and you know about it before the hearing instead of during. He looked at the lamp for a moment. Then he nodded. He spoke to Pete Larson the next morning before breakfast. She did not hear the conversation that happened in the barn, and she was in the kitchen, but she knew it had happened by the quality of Pete at the breakfast table. He ate in the particular careful way of a man who is working something out internally and is slightly too aware of himself to be natural about it. He didn't leave, not that week and not the week after. She did not know what Caleb had said to him. She did not ask. Some things were between a man and his people, and her job was not to know everything, it was to know the right things at the right times. 10 days before the hearing, Holtz sent a letter that changed the shape of what they thought they were walking into. Rourke's survey expert from Helena had submitted his report to the territorial court. Eliza read the summary Holst had forwarded, which was dense with technical language about the 1871 survey methodology, and 3 pages of argument about the imprecision of boundary markers established in that period. It was carefully constructed, she could see that, and she could also see that it required a reading of the Crane letter that was possible only if you were willing to ignore the field note almost entirely. He's pretending the field note doesn't exist, she said. Caleb was across the table from her. His expert doesn't reference it directly, he said. Holst flagged that. It's the stronger document, she said. It's more specific. If their expert is building an argument without addressing it, it means he can't address it. You can't argue ambiguity about a formation when there's a field surveyor's direct observation describing it in that kind of detail. Holst's response will make that explicit, Caleb said. It needs to, she said, because the court will wonder why Rourke's expert avoided it, and if Holst doesn't answer that question loudly, Rourke's team will find a way to reframe the silence. She said it and then stopped, because she was aware that she was now operating at the level of legal strategy, which was not her domain and about which she had no formal training whatsoever. Caleb was looking at her with an expression that was not entirely readable. I'll write that to Holst, he said. I know you will, she said. I'm just thinking out loud. I know, he said. Keep doing it. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. Whatever you're thinking when you read these letters, I want to hear it. You've been right more than you've been wrong. She did not respond to that in any way that would require her to acknowledge what it meant. She went back to the letter. The night before Caleb was due to travel to the territorial hearing, she made a meal that nobody requested and nobody expected. It was a Tuesday, and nothing about Tuesday was special. But she had been thinking about it for several days, about the fact that the next morning Caleb would ride out before dawn to reach the territorial court with Holst, and about what it meant to send someone into something important without marking it in any way. She made the beef broth soup that Garrett had said smelled like something his mother made, and she made biscuits without the burned section that had been Noah's contribution to the repertoire, and she made a skillet cake with the last of the dried apples she'd been rationing, and a measure of the molasses and the dried fruit that Silas had mentioned his mother used, which she had quietly started keeping on the highest shelf in anticipation of a moment that felt right. Noah came into the kitchen at 4 o'clock and looked at the scope of what was being prepared and said, Is something happening? Supper, she said. He looked at her. Go set the table, she said, properly. All 12 places, he went. Caleb came in from the range at 5:30 and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he smelled what was on the stove. He looked at her with the expression she had long since stopped trying to categorize and had simply begun to look forward to. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. Can you tell the men supper is at 6? I want everyone at the table. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. The meal had a quality she had not manufactured intentionally, but which arrived anyway, the quality of a table where people have been through something together and are sitting down in the full weight of it. 12 men and Caleb and Noah and herself, which was not entirely the custom but which felt right. And she had set a place for herself without asking anyone whether she should. Nobody mentioned it. Silas Boone looked at her place and then at his own bowl and started eating. The conversation was not dramatic. It was the conversation of men who knew each other complaints about equipment, a dispute about the fence line in the south field that had been running for 3 weeks without resolution, Garrett saying something quietly funny that made the young hand next to him laugh unexpectedly. Noah ate his soup with the focused appreciation of someone who had helped prepare it and was checking his work. Walter Crowe said nothing, as was his habit. but he cleaned his bowl and sat for longer than usual afterward. When the skillet cake came out, Silas Boone looked at it. He looked at Eliza. "Dried peach," she said. Something passed across his face. He looked at his plate. He served himself a piece and ate it in the particular silence of a man experiencing something he hadn't been prepared for. She did not watch him do it. She talked with Garrett about the south fence and agreed that the post situation was genuinely unfixable with the current materials and that someone needed to put in a proper order. She talked with Noah about the bread ratio she'd been adjusting. She listened to the table around her with the part of her attention that was always listening, even when the rest of it was occupied elsewhere. After dinner, when the men had gone and Noah had cleared the dishes and gone to bed, she was at the wash basin when Caleb came back into the kitchen. He stood in the middle of the room. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before I leave tomorrow." She kept her hands in the wash water. She did not turn around. "All right," she said. "Whatever happens at the hearing," he said. "Win or lose, I want you to know that." He stopped, and the stopping had the quality of a man who has practiced something and has arrived at the point where practice runs out. "The ranch, it's different now. It's different because of you. And I don't mean the kitchen, though I mean the kitchen. He stopped again. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the lamp, making him look more human than he usually did, less certain, which was not a bad thing. She had come to understand over 5 months that the certainty was a surface he wore well, and that underneath it there were the same kinds of cracked and imperfectly repaired places that everybody had. "Caleb," she said, "I know it's not. He started." "I know," she said. "I know what you're trying to say." He looked at her. "Go to the hearing," she said. "Come back." She held his gaze and let herself say the rest of it, which she had not said to anyone in the way she was saying it now. "I'll be here." Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not in the way of stories where people transform visibly, just a settling, the way a structure settles when it finds its actual level rather than the level it's been performing. "All right," he said. He left the kitchen. She heard him in the hall, heard his door close, heard the house settle into its nighttime sounds around her. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. In the morning before 4, she would be up to make coffee and biscuits for him to take on the road. She would pack them in the cloth the way she always did, and she would set them on the small kitchen table without ceremonies. And he would take them without making more of it than it was. That was the thing about this place. She thought the way everything that mattered happened in the space between what was said and what was understood. The table full of men who had not liked her and then had. The boy who had learned to cut an onion properly and was now making bread alone. Silas Boone and the dried peach. Caleb at his desk with the lamp reading a letter she'd handed him, asking her to keep thinking out loud. She turned out the lamp and walked down the hall to her room. Outside, the ranch was quiet. The horses in the barn, the bunkhouse full of sleeping men, the western range with its granite formation standing exactly where it had been for centuries, indifferent to what anyone argued about it. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about 6 weeks from now and 6 months from now, and all the practical, specific, difficult things that would need doing between now and then: the hearing, the result, the next season's provisions, Noah's ongoing education in bread ratios, the south fence situation that Garrett was right about. She was not a sentimental person. She had learned in the years that had made her that sentiment was a luxury with a high price, and she had rarely been in a position to afford it. But she let herself, just for the length of time it took to fall asleep, feel what it was to be somewhere that would still be there when she woke up. Somewhere she had not just found but built, piece by piece with the work of her hands and the full weight of her attention. The morning would come early as mornings did. She was ready for it. She packed his biscuits before 4 in the morning, the way she had said she would. The cloth was one she'd washed the night before, specifically for the purpose, which was a practical thing, and nothing more than that. And she folded it around the biscuits with the same attention she gave everything in the kitchen, not carelessly, not with excessive ceremony. She added a small piece of the skillet cake left from the previous evening, wrapped separately. She set the bundle on the small kitchen table where he would find it. She had coffee ready when she heard his door. He came into the kitchen already dressed for travel, which meant he had not slept well, or had woken early from the habit of a man who could not entirely rest when something important was pending. She did not comment on either possibility. She poured his coffee and set it where he usually sat and went back to the stove. He drank the coffee standing, which was not his custom. He picked up the bundle from the table and looked at it for a moment. "The cake is from last night," she said. "It travels better than the biscuits." "Thank you," he said. She heard what was underneath the 2 words, not just gratitude for the food, but the larger thing that neither of them had found the complete language for the night before. She accepted it in the spirit it was given. "Holst knows what he has," she said. The field note is stronger than their expert's argument. Trust what's in writing. I know, he said. In Walter's account, she turned to face him. The court will see a man with 16 years of direct knowledge against a hired expert. That matters. Caleb looked at her with the particular quality she had grown accustomed to, the full attention of someone who was not performing listening but actually doing it. I'll be back in 4 days, he said, 5 at the outside. I know, she said. He picked up his coat from the chair back, put on his hat, and looked at her one more time from the doorway. It was not a long look. It was the look of a man making a note of something he intends to return to. Then he was gone, and the kitchen had the particular quality of a room that has recently held more than its usual amount of feeling. She turned back to the stove. The ranch would need feeding in 2 hours. There was work to do. The 4 days he was gone were not the hardest 4 days she had spent at Black Pine, but they had a texture unlike the ones that had come before. The ranch ran on its rhythms, the hands knew their work. The animals had their schedule. Noah managed the kitchen beside her with a competence that had developed quietly over months until it was now genuinely useful rather than aspirational. But there was an absence that she moved around without acknowledging. The way you move around furniture, in a room you know well in the dark. Walter came in from the range on the second afternoon and sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which he had never done before. He asked for coffee, which she gave him. He sat for a while without saying anything, which was consistent with his character. He'll do all right, Walter said finally. Holt's a careful man. I know, she said. The court in the territory tends toward the physical evidence when the documentary evidence is disputed, Walter said. I've seen it before. Not this same situation, but similar. She looked at him. You've been to territorial hearings? Twice, he said, watching, not involved. He drank his coffee. The second one was about a boundary dispute not far from here. 12 years ago, the man with the clear documentation won. The man with the hired expert lost. She understood he was telling her this deliberately, and she appreciated it in the way she appreciated Walter's particular forms of communication, plain, specific, and rare enough to be meaningful. Thank you, she said. He nodded and drank his coffee and left without further conversation. Silas was present and working, and had in the days since the dinner before Caleb's departure stopped being a man who kept a position and become, more simply, a man who was where he was. She noticed this without making anything of it. Some changes happen that way, not through a moment, but through the accumulation of moments until the distance between where someone started and where they arrived was too large to see all at once. On the third day, Garrett came to the kitchen with a question that was not about the ranch work, but that he delivered as though it were, which was its own kind of information. If the hearing goes the wrong way, he said, what happens to the Western operation? She looked at him steadily. That's not a question I'm prepared to answer, she said, because the hearing isn't going to go the wrong way. He absorbed this. But if it did, he said. Garrett, she said, with the tone she had developed for conversations she needed to close before they spiraled into the kind of anxiety that infected other people, go fix the south fence. You've been talking about that fence for a month. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the first time anyone at Black Pine had used that particular form of address with her, and he said it without irony. He went and fixed the south fence, which had indeed been waiting long enough. Caleb came back on the evening of the 4th day. She heard the horse before she saw him, Fletcher's particular footfall on the yard, which she had learned to distinguish from the others without meaning to. She was in the kitchen, finishing the supper dishes. Noah looked up from the bread he was wrapping. He's back, Noah said. I hear him, she said. She finished the dish she was working on, dried her hands, and walked to the kitchen door. Caleb was dismounting in the yard. He moved with the stiffness of a man who had been on a horse for most of 2 days and whose body had opinions about it. One of the hands, the young one, whose name was Cully, and who had the disposition of a person who genuinely wanted to be useful, came out of the barn to take Fletcher. Caleb handed off the reins without looking at Cully, because he was looking at the kitchen door. She stayed in the doorway. The yard was in its evening light, the long gold of late day in Montana, which made everything look more permanent than it was. She watched him cross the yard, and she read what she could from his walk and his posture before he was close enough for his face to be clear, because she had learned over months that a man's body tells you what he's decided before his face does. His shoulders were not held against a result he was managing. They were simply his shoulders, and the way they moved told her what she needed to know before he reached the porch steps. She stepped back from the doorway to let him in. He came into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at her, and his face had the quality it occasionally had in the early mornings at the small table, unguarded in the specific way of someone too tired to maintain the surface and not particularly inclined to try. We won, he said. She let out a breath. The court accepted Holst's submission, he said. The field note was the deciding document. The judge said. He paused, and she could see him retrieving the exact language because he had been carrying it, that the physical evidence and the supporting documentary record established the boundary without reasonable ambiguity. Rourke's expert was present and cross-examined, and could not account for the field note's description of the formation in a way that supported their position. She sat down at the kitchen table. She had not planned to her legs, simply made the decision for her. The western pasture, she said, legally confirmed as Black Pine Land, he said. Creek access intact. He was quiet for a moment. Rourke can appeal to the district court if he chooses. Holst says the grounds are weak, and the cost would be significant. He doesn't think Rourke will do it. She thought about that. A man who settled when his position was weak was one thing. A man who pursued a losing appeal was another. Rourke was calculating, not reckless. Holst was probably right. He won't appeal, she said. Caleb sat down across from her. He looked like a man who had been holding something tightly for 5 months and had just been told he could set it down, and who was discovering that setting something down after holding it that long required a moment of adjustment. There's coffee, she said. I know, he said, but he didn't move to get it. She got up and poured it for him. She set it in front of him and sat back down and let the kitchen hold them in its quiet, which it was good at. Walter was right, she said, about the documentary evidence. Walter's been right about most things for 16 years, Caleb said. It's an underappreciated quality. She almost smiled at that. I'll tell him you said so. He'll ignore the compliment and get back to work, Caleb said. That's also a quality. The coffee sat between them steaming. Outside she could hear the bunkhouse sounds of men settling in for the evening voices. Boots, the specific quality of 12 people who have been working hard all day and are now in the portion of the day that belongs to them. I need to tell them, Caleb said, the men. Tonight, she said, after supper.
Yes.
He picked up the coffee and drank. He set it down and looked at her across the table in the lamplight. I was thinking on the ride back, he said, with the deliberateness of someone who has organized what they want to say and is now committed to saying it. She waited. About what I started to say the other night, he said, before the hearing. I remember what you started to say, she said. I know you do. He held the coffee cup in both hands, which was something he did when he was working through, something he cared about more than he was comfortable showing. I want to finish it. She looked at him. This ranch, he said, has been running on a kind of stubbornness for 4 years, since Margaret died. He said the name with the particular care of someone handling something that has been carefully set aside and is now being deliberately picked up. I kept it going because stopping wasn't something I knew how to do. But it wasn't what it should have been. You could see it. The men could see it. I could see it, though I didn't look directly at it very often. She did not say anything. This was not a moment for interruption. You changed that, he said. Not by he stopped, and she could see him rejecting several versions of what came next. Not by fixing things from the outside. By being here in the full sense of it. By caring about the kitchen and the men and the land and the documents in the file cabinet. All of it, the way you'd care about something that was yours. He looked at her steadily. And I've been aware for months that the reason I wanted you to stay had stopped being about the cooking around the time Garrett said that soup smelled like his mother's. She looked at him. He looked back. I love you, he said. It came out plainly, not decorated, not performed. Just said the way he said most important things. I don't have a more complicated version of it than that. The kitchen was very quiet. She had known, in the way you know something before you let yourself know it, that this moment was coming. She had been managing her awareness of it for months, storing it in the part of herself where she kept things that required more careful handling than she was currently able to give them. And now it was here, and the careful management was no longer required, and what was left was simply the fact of it. I know, she said. I've known for a while. I suspected you did, he said. There was something almost like wryness in his expression. You're better at knowing things than most people. Not always, she said. I was slow to know this one. He looked at her. Because it frightened me, she said. It cost something to say it that plainly, and she paid the cost. I've been somewhere that mattered and lost it before, more than once. In different ways, she looked at her hands on the table. A kitchen you've built, and a table you've filled, and men you've learned, and a piece of land with a granite formation in the right place at the western boundary, those are things I understand how to hold. What you're saying is something different. I know it is, he said. It's harder to hold, she said. Yes, he said, it is. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to hold it alone. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression she had finally learned to read, the one that was not measuring or assessing or managing, but simply present in the full weight of his attention. Stay, he said. Not as my cook, not as my employee. As the person who belongs beside me in this home, on this land. As the person I want to build what comes next with. He paused. If that's something you want. She thought about the morning she had walked away from the copper rail with wet feet and $4.60 and a crack in her boot sole. She thought about the moment she had stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the pantry and deciding that yes, she could cook for 12 men on a broken stove with these ingredients. She thought about Noah's uneven onion cuts and Silas's dried peach and Walter's coffee and the field note in the wrong section of the household files and the granite formation standing in the Montana afternoon light, exactly where it had always been. She thought about what she had been looking for across all the years and arrangements that had preceded this one, without always having the words for it. A home, a place that recognized her. Yes, she said, that's something I want. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of a man who has been careful with his hands for a long time and is now choosing deliberately to use them for something other than work. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a moment in the kitchen that had been hers. For 5 months, the kitchen that had a stove that ran level and clean now, a pantry that was organized in a way she could find things in at 4 a.m, a bread hook on the wall that Noah had helped her install, because the original had come loose, a window that let in the morning light at an angle that changed with the seasons. Then she got up to start supper, because the men needed feeding, and the evening didn't stop for the things that happened in it. She told Caleb to let her tell the men. He looked at her with some surprise. About the hearing, she clarified. You should hear it from someone who was here while you were gone. It lands differently that way. He thought about it and said, all right. She gathered them at the table after supper, all 12, and Caleb at the head, and Noah at the far end, with his particular attentiveness, and she stood where she could see all of them, and said it plainly. The territorial court ruled in favor of Black Pine, she said. The western boundary is confirmed, the creek access stays. Rourke's challenge is dismissed. The table was quiet for one breath. Then Garrett said something under his breath that was not entirely appropriate and entirely genuine. And Cully hit the table with an open palm in a way that made the dishes rattle, and the young hand next to him said finally in a tone of profound personal relief, and several voices started at once. She let it run for a moment. It was the right response to the end of 5 months of held breath, and a room full of men who had been uncertain about something important needed to express the end of that uncertainty in the way men in groups express things loudly and overlapping and without particular elegance. Walter Crowe sat at his end of the table and said nothing, which was also the right response for Walter. Silas Boone, at the far end, looked at his plate for a moment and then looked up at Caleb. Good, Silas said. It was one word. It was sufficient. When the noise cell settled, Pete Larson, who had stayed, who was sitting 2 seats from the middle, with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was still making his peace with, said, What about Rourke? He can appeal to the district court, Eliza said. Holst doesn't think he will. The grounds aren't strong enough to justify the cost. He'll find something else to try, Pete said. Not bitterly, just with the realism of a man who had thought about this. Probably, she said, eventually, but not this, and not soon. She looked around the table. What you did here, staying, working, Walter giving his account, all of it, that's why the case was strong enough to win. That's worth knowing. She looked at Walter when she said that last part. He looked back at her with the narrowed eyes that meant he had heard it and was filing it appropriately. Caleb, at the head of the table, said nothing through any of this. He sat and let the room be what it was and watched the men he was responsible for process the end of something difficult. She had understood weeks ago that this was one of the things he was genuinely good at, the capacity to let a room breathe without controlling it. After the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, out to the porch, Pete and Cully staying to help Noah carry dishes in a way that had become a custom nobody had formally established. Caleb sat at the empty table with his coffee and looked at the room. She was clearing the last of it. She worked around him the way she always did, in the comfortable efficiency of someone who has done the same task in the same space, enough times that the space has become an extension of how she thinks. You handled that better than I would have, he said. You would have handled it fine, she said. I would have been too formal about it, he said. You gave them something to feel and then something to think about. That's the right order. She looked at him. I've been watching you do that for 5 months, he said. With the food, with the men. You put the feeling first. The information comes after, once people are ready to receive it. She thought about that. I hadn't articulated it that way. I noticed, he said. It's better when it's not articulated. It works because you're not thinking about it. She sat down across from him. The table between them was cleared now, just the lamp and the coffee, and the evening settling around the house. What happens now? She said. Not about them, she meant the ranch, the season, the things that needed doing. But the question had a larger shape, and they both knew it. The western pasture needs the fence work that got postponed, he said. The spring cattle count is 2 weeks out. The provisions need restocking before summer. He paused. The room off the back hallway is too small. She looked at him. For a permanent arrangement, he said, with a carefulness that was almost formal, and that she found unexpectedly endearing. It is small, she agreed. There's a room on the upper floor that's been used for storage for 4 years, he said. It has 2 windows. Better light. That would require clearing it out, she said. Yes, he said. I was thinking Noah could help. She looked at her coffee. She looked at him. She thought about the upper room she had never been in, with 2 windows and 4 years of stored things that had belonged to a life that had been set carefully aside and needed now to be moved, which was not the same as discarded, simply moved, to make room for what came next. All right, she said. We'll clear it out. They told the men the following morning before the day's work began. Not with ceremony, Caleb gathered them in the yard the way he gathered them for any practical matter, and said it plainly, that Eliza was staying, not as the cook, though she would keep the kitchen, but as the person who was part of Black Pine in the full sense of it. There was a moment of processing. Garrett said, "About time," which was not precisely appropriate but was genuinely meant, and several of the other men had expressions she could not entirely read, but that were not negative. Silas Boone stood at the back of the group with his hat in his hands, the way she had first seen him in the kitchen doorway the night he'd told her about the dried peach. He looked at her when Caleb was done talking. He gave her the slight nod, the one she had learned to receive, as his version of something considerably larger. She nodded back. Walter said nothing. This was not a surprise. But he was the first one back to work, which was, she had learned, his version of endorsement. Noah, who had known before anyone else, because he had been in the kitchen the previous evening and had a quality of awareness that was beyond his years, said nothing either. He had already said his piece that morning, while they were starting the bread, which had consisted of exactly 6 words. "I'm glad you're not leaving." She had told him she wasn't planning to leave for some time, and he had gone back to the dough with the expression of a person who has confirmed something important and can now move on. Pete Larson shook Caleb's hand after the group dispersed, which was a specific and deliberate thing, and then looked at Eliza for a moment. "The south fence is done," he said. "I heard," she said. "Garrett told me." "I helped," Pete said, and walked away. She understood that this was Pete Larson's way of saying that he had decided, and the decision was not going anywhere. The upper room took 3 days to clear. It was not a small task. 4 years of set-aside things accumulated in ways that were not straightforward boxes of household items. Furniture moved in from other rooms to make space elsewhere. A wardrobe that required 2 men and a significant reorganization of the doorframe to remove. She worked alongside Caleb for most of it, and Noah came in the evenings after kitchen work, and even Garrett appeared one afternoon, because he had apparently decided to be useful in this particular way, without anyone asking him. She found on the second day a box of photographs near the back wall. She recognized them before Caleb did. She saw his face when he came in, and noticed the box on the floor where she had set it. She had not opened it. "I found it behind the wardrobe," she said. "I didn't look inside."
Yeah.
He picked it up. He held it for a moment in the way he had held the letter from Rourke, with the particular weight of something that required a conscious decision about how to proceed. "Margaret's photographs," he said. "I thought so," she said. He stood with the box for a long moment. She stayed where she was and did not fill the silence with anything. "There's a cabinet in the front parlor," he said finally. "Bottom shelf. I'll put them there." "That's a good place for them," she said. He carried the box out. She heard him in the parlor, no voices, just the particular sounds of someone handling something carefully. After a while, she heard the cabinet door close. He came back and looked at the room. "Better light in here than I remembered," he said. "The west window is larger," she said. He looked at the west window where the afternoon light was coming in at an angle that would change to gold by evening. "Yes," he said. She looked at the room, the walls that needed whitewashing, the floor that needed attention, the 2 windows and the proportion of the space, and she felt the particular feeling that she had encountered in the kitchen on the first morning, standing in front of the stove she had learned to manage. The feeling of a problem that was solvable, and a space that would become hers through the work of making it so. It was the nature of a home, not found whole but made, piece by piece, with the work of hands that chose to be there. The week after the room was cleared, she went into town. Not with Caleb alone, which was its own kind of statement, and she made it deliberately. She went to Dunbar's general store for provisions. She walked in through the front door and set her list on the counter in front of Martin Dunbar and waited while he filled it. And she was aware the whole time of the nature of the moment, of what it meant to be standing in a space that had turned her away, in the same worn boots, carrying a different kind of weight than she had carried that morning almost 6 months ago. Dunbar was not warm. He was not exactly cold. He was the specific temperature of a man who understood that something had shifted in the calculation and was adjusting, without acknowledging that there had ever been a calculation. He filled the order, she paid, she picked up the supplies. At the door she stopped, because there was one thing she had decided to say, and had been carrying since the beginning. "Mr. Dunbar," she said. He looked up. "You have a hiring sign in your window again," she said. "For kitchen help." He looked at the sign, which he clearly had forgotten about. "Whoever applies," she said. "You might give them more than 4 seconds before you decide." She walked out. She was not certain what she expected from that, perhaps nothing. Perhaps it was simply the need to say it, because some things need saying, not because they change anything, but because they are true and have been true for a long time, and the silence around them has cost something. On the walk back to the ranch, with the supplies in the saddlebag, and Fletcher moving at his own pace along the northern road, she thought about the woman who had walked this road in the other direction 6 months ago. Not with pity for her, she had never pitied that woman, had found pity a useless response to her own situation, but with a kind of recognition. That woman had been afraid in the way of someone who has been turned away enough times to be afraid of trying, and had tried anyway, because the alternative was not trying, and she did not know how to do that. That stubbornness had carried her to the door of Black Pine Ranch. Everything else had been the work. There was a lesson in it, she thought. That was not particular to her. Something about the way worth operates in the world, how it is not conferred by the people who look at you and make their decisions in 4 seconds, but is demonstrated over time through the accumulation of what you actually do, and about the way a place becomes home, not through being given it, but through the daily, unglamorous, imperfect work of choosing to be there fully. She had spent years in situations where she was present in the functional sense, cooking, cleaning, existing in the space without being seen. Black Pine had been different, not immediately and not easily and not without cost, but different in the way that matters, which is that she had been seen by the men who ate her food and gradually understood what she was doing, by Walter with his particular forms of acknowledgement, by Silas with the dried peach, by Noah at 16 learning to hear what the butter tells you when it hits the pan, by Caleb, who had looked at her across the kitchen in the early morning more times than she could count, and had seen not a woman performing competence, but a person fully present in what she was doing. She thought about what she would tell someone, if there were someone to tell some younger version of herself, walking away from another closed door in another town with wet feet and not enough money, and the specific exhaustion of being dismissed before being known. She would not tell her it works out. It doesn't always work out, and she knew that, and false comfort was worse than no comfort. She would not tell her the right person will see you, because right people are not guaranteed, and the world is not organized around fairness. She would tell her, keep being fully what you are, even when it costs you, because the alternative is becoming less of yourself in hopes that smaller will be more acceptable, and it never is. She would tell her, competence is not performance, and knowing the difference matters. She would tell her, the person who dismisses you in 4 seconds is giving you information about themselves, not about you. File it and move on. She would tell her, a kitchen with a broken stove and an empty pantry is not the end. It's where you start. The first morning she woke in the upper room was a Saturday in early summer. The light came in through the west window at an angle she hadn't anticipated earlier than she expected, and brighter, catching the freshly whitewashed wall in a way that made the room feel larger than its dimensions. She lay in the better bed Caleb had found it in the storage section of the barn, which had been its own small story involving Garrett's mechanical intuitions about the frame, and 2 hours of work she had observed from the barn door with her arms crossed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the ranch waking up. She could hear distantly Noah in the kitchen. The sound was specific and identifiable because she had been listening to it long enough to know it the particular movement of someone who had learned to work in a space and was working in it competently, not perfectly, but with the real competence that comes from a body that has done something enough times to have built knowledge into the doing. She lay there for a moment longer than usual. She gave herself that. Then she got up. She washed her face and dressed and ran her hands over the wall of the upper room, the wall she had whitewashed herself, with Noah's help and Cully's earnest but occasionally counterproductive assistance, and felt the texture of it under her palms. She went downstairs. Noah had coffee ready, which was new. He had started doing this sometime in the last 3 weeks. Without announcing it, the coffee was simply there when she came in, ready, the way she had always had it ready for Caleb. She accepted it and looked at what he was doing with the bread. Hydration's better today, she said. I measured it this time, he said, instead of estimating. Measuring is how you learn, she said. Estimating is how you eventually stop needing to measure. Not yet. I know, he said. Not yet. She drank her coffee and watched him work. He had grown in the months since she had arrived, not just taller, though he was taller, but in the specific way of a person who has been given real work and real instruction, and has met both with genuine effort. He was not going to be a famous cook or a celebrated one. He was going to be someone who could feed people well, reliably, with whatever was available, and who understood that this was not a small thing. She had told him that once, directly, because he was at an age where direct things were sometimes necessary. What you do in a kitchen feeds people in a way that matters, she had said. Not just the food. The fact that someone made it carefully for them. That's a different kind of being fed. He had looked at her for a moment with the expression she recognized as him snozzering something. Is that why you do it? He said. She had thought about that honestly. Partly, she said. And partly because it's the thing I'm good at, and being good at something you do every day makes the days worth the trouble. He had nodded and gone back to work. She suspected he had been thinking about it since. Caleb came down at 6, which was later than usual for him, and she understood that he had also allowed himself the morning, which was its own kind of information. He poured coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the yard, and then at her, and then at Noah's bread, in that particular order, and his face had the settled quality she had come to think of as what he looked like when he wasn't managing anything. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. "South fence held through the rain," she said. "Pete told me," he said. "Cully thinks the east pasture needs rotating," she said. "He's right," he said. "I'll move them this week." Noah set the bread to rest and began on the biscuits without being asked. Caleb moved from the doorway to the small table, which remained his particular place in the kitchen, despite the change in arrangements. She sat across from him. Outside, she could hear the ranch beginning its day, Walter's voice at the barn, Garrett and Pete talking near the equipment shed, the horses, the particular sound of a working place that has its own momentum and does not require anyone to decide to begin it. She thought about the woman who had stood on the wooden sidewalk in Harlow Creek on a May morning with wet feet and $4.60. She thought about the 12 men who had looked at a bowl of beans and a skillet of cornbread and made their decisions. She thought about a granite formation on a hillside in the western pasture, standing exactly where it had always been, indifferent to arguments about it. She thought about the field note in the wrong section of the household file, about the thing found by accident, or by attention, she had never been certain which, and had decided eventually that the distinction didn't matter as much as the fact of looking. Caleb reached across the small table and put his hand over hers, the way he had in the kitchen the night he had said what he needed to say. She turned her hand over and held his. Neither of them spoke. The coffee was hot. The bread was resting. Noah was making biscuits, and making them better than he had made them last week, and would make them better still next week. The table would be full at 6. It had been full for months, and it would be full for the foreseeable future, and what had once been a collection of men who ate in the functional silence of people, with no particular reason to be present to each other, was now something else, not a perfect thing, not a frictionless thing, but a real thing. The kind of real that only accumulates through time and difficulty, and the daily choice to show up fully. This was what she had been looking for, she thought. Not the romance of it, though that was here too, in the hand across the table, and the morning light on the whitewashed wall of the upper room, but the substance of it. The specific weight of a place that knows you. The particular satisfaction of having built something that did not exist before you arrived. She had walked through a door with worn boots and almost nothing to her name, and she had made a meal with a broken stove and an empty pantry, and she had stayed. And the staying, more than anything else, more than the finding of documents, or the identifying of formations, or the navigating of men who had decided things about her in advance, the staying had been the thing. The daily, unglamorous, not always comfortable decision to be fully present in a place. To invest in it the way you invest in something you have decided belongs to you and that you belong to. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was, in the end, what a home was. Noah set the first pan of biscuits in the oven. The kitchen filled with the smell of it, butter and flour, and the particular warmth of a stove that ran clean and level, that had been fixed properly and maintained carefully, that could be trusted to do what was needed. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the Montana morning was doing what Montana mornings did, indifferent and enormous and entirely real, asking nothing of anyone and offering everything to those willing to work in it. She was ready for the day. She had been ready for a long time.